That night, someone discovered honey could kill you. Before we start, likes and subscribes help me keep making these. Where are you listening from? Drop your city and time in the comments. I'm always reading them, thinking, wait, people in New York listen to history stories to sleep. Okay, tonight we are talking about why medieval raw honey was a superfood, but modern honey makes you sick. But before we go anywhere, get cozy. Pillows good? Blanket situation handled? Perfect. Trust me on this one. You're standing in a stone monastery kitchen in 1347, watching a monk named Brother Thomas lift a clay jar from a dark shelf. You dip your finger into the bowl and lick your finger to taste the honey. You eat a runny honey with a sharp flavour. A few bees continue to fly around the bowl. The honey inside glows amber in the candlelight, thick and cloudy, nothing like the clear golden liquid you've seen in grocery stores. He dips a wooden spoon into it, and you notice something strange. There are tiny particles suspended throughout, bits of wax, pollen grains, maybe even a bee leg or two. He doesn't seem bothered. He eats it slowly, deliberately, like medicine, because that's exactly what it is. The monastery smells like damp stone and beeswax, that sweet waxy scent mixing with the earthy smell of the rushes covering the floor. Brother Thomas closes his eyes as he swallows, and you wonder what he's thinking. But I haven't told you the most important part yet. This honey, this cloudy, imperfect substance, is keeping him alive in ways he doesn't fully understand. It's healing wounds that would otherwise fester and kill. It's preserving food through winters that claim half the village. It's providing energy that helps him survive on a diet of bread, pottage, and occasional dried fish. You watch him replace the jar carefully, reverently even. The way he handles it tells you something. This isn't just food, it's currency, medicine, and survival, all sealed in clay. Outside the window you can hear bees humming in the monastery garden, working flowers you can't quite see in the twilight. The sound is constant, purposeful, ancient. Those bees are making something humans have relied on for thousands of years, something that never spoils, never rots, never stops being exactly what it is. Brother Thomas wipes the spoon on a cloth and hangs it on a hook. He doesn't wash it. There's no need. Honey is self-cleaning, self-preserving, almost magical in its simplicity. He walks toward the door, his sandals scraping against stone, and you follow him out into the cloister. The evening air is cool now, carrying the scent of lavender and rosemary from the herb garden. You can feel the temperature dropping, that specific chill that comes when the sun disappears behind monastery walls. But when morning came, who would understand what made that honey so different from what you'd find 7 centuries later? You're walking through the monastery apiary now, rows of woven skeps arranged in the garden like sleeping animals. Each one is about the size of an upturned basket, made from coiled straw and sealed with mud. The bees move in and out of small openings at the base, unbothered by your presence. Brother Thomas kneels beside one skep, listening. You lean closer and hear it too. A low, vibrating hum, like the earth itself is breathing. He doesn't wear protective gear, no veil, no gloves, no smoke, just his brown woolen habit and bare hands. The bees know him, or at least they don't see him as a threat. You watch as he gently lifts the edge of the skep and peers inside. The smell hits you immediately. Warm wax, sweet pollen, something almost intoxicating. It's not just sugar, it's complex, layered, alive. You breathe it in and feel something shift in your chest, a kind of calm you weren't expecting. Brother Thomas reaches in with his bare hand and pulls out a section of honeycomb, bees still crawling across it. He brushes them off gently, and they fly away without stinging. The comb is heavy, dripping, irregular. Some cells are capped with wax, others still open, filled with honey in various stages of ripeness. He doesn't take much, just enough. The monks understand something modern beekeepers have forgotten. You can't take everything. The bees need reserves for winter, for survival, for the lean months when flowers don't bloom. Can you imagine yourself in this quiet stillness, watching a man who speaks to bees without words? He carries the comb back inside, and you follow. The kitchen is darker now, just a single candle burning on the table. He places the comb in a wooden bowl and begins pressing it gently with a pestle, not crushing it, just encouraging the honey to separate from the wax. It flows slowly, reluctantly, thick as tree sap. You notice the colour, darker than you expected, almost brown in places, with flecks of gold and amber. It smells like wildflowers and earth, and something faintly medicinal. He pours the honey through a loose cloth, catching the larger chunks of wax but leaving everything else. The pollen, the propolis, the enzymes, the trace minerals, all of it stays in. That's the difference. That's what makes it medicine. He fills a small clay jar and seals it with a cork, then wraps it in linen. Tomorrow he'll take it to the infirmary, where a monk with an infected leg wound waits. The honey will go directly into the wound, and within days, the infection will begin to clear. No one knows why, they just know it works. But I haven't told you why modern honey can't do the same thing. You stand there in the candlelight, watching Brother Thomas clean the bowl with a damp cloth, his movements slow and practiced. Outside, the bees are settling in for the night, clustering together inside their skep, generating heat, surviving, just like they've done for 50 million years. You're in a laboratory now, 700 years later, standing under fluorescent lights that hum with a different kind of energy. A food scientist named Dr. Patricia Chen is holding a jar of store-bought honey up to the light, and it's perfectly clear. Not a single particle visible. It looks like liquid gold, like something precious and pure, but her face tells you something else entirely. She's frowning. She sets the jar down on the stainless steel counter with a soft clink that echoes in the sterile space. The lab smells like nothing, which is somehow worse than any smell, antiseptic and empty. She picks up another jar, this one from a small local beekeeper, and holds them side by side. The difference is obvious. The commercial honey is transparent, uniform, almost artificial in its perfection. The local honey is cloudy, with visible sediment at the bottom, darker, more substantial. You can see layers in it, variations in colour and thickness. Dr. Chen opens the commercial jar first. The smell is sweet, but flat, one-dimensional, just sugar. She dips a glass rod into it and lifts it out, watching how it flows. Too thin, too fast. She makes a note on her clipboard, and you try to read it, but her handwriting is terrible, something about viscosity and water content. She opens the second jar, the local one, and the smell is different immediately. Floral, complex, almost medicinal. You catch hints of clover, maybe goldenrod, something earthy underneath. But I haven't told you what happened to the honey between Brother Thomas's monastery and this lab. She dips another glass rod into the local honey, and it clings differently, heavier, more reluctant to let go. She nods, satisfied with something you don't quite understand. Then she walks over to a microscope and places a drop of each honey on separate slides. You lean over her shoulder as she adjusts the focus on the commercial sample. Nothing. Just uniform amber liquid. No pollen grains, no propolis, no cellular structures at all. It's been filtered so thoroughly that it's barely recognizable as a natural substance. She switches to the local honey slide, and suddenly the microscope reveals an entire world. Pollen grains, of different shapes and sizes, some round, some elongated, each one a tiny signature of the flowers the bees visited. Fragments of propolis, that sticky resin bees collect from tree buds, loaded with antimicrobial compounds. Bits of royal jelly, enzymes, proteins, all the things that make honey more than just sugar water. This is what Brother Thomas's honey looked like under magnification, though he never had a microscope to see it. Dr. Chen leans back in her chair and crosses her arms. The fluorescent lights flicker once, briefly, then steady. You can hear the ventilation system pushing filtered air through the room, that constant white noise of modern buildings. She's thinking about something, working through a problem in her mind. When she finally speaks, it's almost to herself, but you hear every word clearly in the empty lab. You're sitting in a processing facility now, somewhere in the Midwest, watching industrial-scale honey production. The room is enormous, the size of an airplane hangar, filled with stainless steel tanks and pipes that run along the ceiling like metallic veins. The sound is overwhelming at first, pumps churning, motors humming, valves clicking open and shut. Everything is automated, efficient, sterile. There's not a single bee in sight. A worker in a white coat and hairnet walks past you, checking gauges on a control panel. He doesn't look at the honey itself, just numbers on screens, temperature readings, pressure levels, flow rates. The honey is moving through heated pipes at exactly 160 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to make it flow like water, thin enough to filter through microscopic mesh screens that catch everything larger than a few microns. Every particle, every trace of pollen, every bit of propolis, gone. You watch raw honey enter the system through a large intake valve, thick and cloudy and alive with particulates. Then you follow its journey through the maze of pipes and filters. By the time it emerges into the filling station, it's transformed into that perfectly clear, shelf-stable product that never crystallizes, never changes, never behaves like real honey at all. It's been heated, ultra-filtered, sometimes blended with corn syrup or rice syrup to increase volume and reduce costs. The label will still say 100% pure honey, but something fundamental has been stripped away. Can you imagine standing here, watching medicine turn into candy? The worker checks his watch and makes a note on a tablet. Production quota, met. Quality control, passed. Except the quality they're controlling for has nothing to do with nutrition or medicinal properties. It's about appearance, shelf life, consistency. Consumers want honey that looks like liquid gold, that pours easily, that never crystallizes in the jar. They've been trained to see cloudiness as contamination, crystallization as spoilage, when both are actually signs of real, unprocessed honey. You walk over to the filling station where thousands of identical plastic bears are moving along a conveyor belt, each one receiving exactly 12 ounces of processed honey. The bears are bright yellow, shaped like cartoons, nothing like the clay jars Brother Thomas used. They're designed to be squeezable, convenient, cute. The honey inside them will last for years without changing, which should be a warning sign, but instead gets marketed as a benefit. But I haven't told you what this processing does to your body when you eat it. A quality control supervisor walks through, scanning barcodes and checking fill levels. She's efficient, professional, completely disconnected from the bees that made this honey, or the flowers they visited. To her, this is just another food product, another commodity moving through the supply chain. She doesn't know that honey used to heal wounds, used to be prescribed by physicians, used to be so valuable it was traded like currency. The conveyor belt continues its endless loop, bears marching toward packaging stations where they'll be boxed and shipped to stores across the country. The facility processes 50,000 pounds of honey every day. Somewhere, somehow, bees are making all of this, but you can't picture them here. The connection has been severed completely. Outside the building, the sun is setting, casting long shadows across the parking lot. You can hear traffic in the distance, but no bees, not a single one. You're back in medieval Europe now, standing in a marketplace in Bruges, 1289. The air smells like horse manure and wood smoke, and fresh bread from a bakery somewhere nearby. Vendors are calling out in Flemish, their voices overlapping, creating a constant hum of commerce. You stop at a stall where an old woman is selling honey, and the price makes you do a double take. 1 pound of her honey costs the same as 3 pounds of butter, more than a day's wages for a labourer. She sits on a wooden stool behind her table, 4 clay jars arranged carefully in front of her. Each jar has a small wooden tag hanging from twine around its neck, indicating what kind of honey it is. Heather honey, dark and strong. Clover honey, lighter and milder. Wildflower honey, somewhere in between. Chestnut honey, almost black, bitter and medicinal. She doesn't need to convince anyone of honey's value. Everyone already knows. A merchant approaches, well dressed in wool and fur, and examines the wildflower honey closely. He lifts the lid and smells it, then dips his finger in for a taste. The old woman doesn't object. This is how you buy honey in 1289, by trusting your senses, by knowing what real honey tastes and smells like. The merchant nods, satisfied, and counts out silver coins, real silver, for 1 jar. You watch the transaction and realize honey is luxury, medicine, and necessity all at once. But I haven't told you why medieval people were willing to pay so much. The old woman wraps the jar in cloth and hands it over with both hands, a gesture of respect for what she's selling. The merchant tucks it into his leather satchel like it's made of gold, because in a world without antibiotics, without modern medicine, without refrigeration, honey is one of the few things keeping people alive. It preserves fruit through winter, it heals burns and cuts, it soothes coughs and sore throats. It provides quick energy for people doing manual labour from sunrise to sunset. You watch other customers approach the stall, a mother buying honey for a child with a persistent cough, a baker buying honey to make spiced cakes for a wedding, a monk buying honey to mix with herbs for the monastery infirmary. Each person knows exactly what they're getting and why they need it. There's no confusion about whether it's raw or processed, because those concepts don't exist yet. All honey is raw. All honey is local. All honey is exactly what the bees made. The marketplace is getting crowded now, bodies pressed close, the smell of wool and sweat mixing with spices and fresh fish from another stall. You can feel the energy of commerce, of survival, of a world where every transaction matters because resources are scarce and winter is always coming. The old woman sells her last jar as the church bells ring for none, the afternoon prayer. She packs up her empty jars carefully, wrapping each one in straw to prevent breakage. Can you imagine a world where honey is too precious to waste, too valuable to process into something less? She stands slowly, her joints stiff from sitting, and loads her basket onto her back. You watch her walk away through the crowd, disappearing between a spice merchant and a cloth seller. Tomorrow she'll be back with more jars, more honey, continuing a trade that's existed since humans first learned to rob wild bee nests. The price will be the same, the quality will be the same. Nothing changes because nothing needs to. But 700 years later, everything will. You're in a hospital room in London, 1943, watching a nurse named Margaret apply honey to a soldier's leg wound. The smell of infection is overwhelming at first, that sweet rotten odour of tissue dying. But Margaret doesn't flinch. She's seen worse. The soldier, a young man named Private Collins, watches her with exhausted eyes. He's been in this bed for 2 weeks, and the wound isn't healing. Antibiotics are in short supply, reserved for officers and critical cases. For everyone else, there's honey. Margaret scoops a generous amount from a jar labelled medical-grade honey and spreads it directly into the wound. The soldier winces but doesn't cry out. The honey is thick, almost paste-like, darker than table honey. It's been sourced from specific apiaries in Wales and Scotland, places where bees forage on heather and wildflowers far from industrial agriculture. The hospitals know that not all honey works the same way. They've learned through trial and error that local, raw honey has properties the processed stuff lacks. She wraps the wound in clean gauze and makes a note on his chart. Honey dressing applied, 50-30 hours. She's done this hundreds of times now, ever since the war started and medical supplies became scarce. And the strangest thing is, it works. Wounds that should become gangrenous instead begin to heal. Infections that should spread instead begin to retreat. The doctors can't fully explain it, but they don't need to. Results speak louder than theory. But I haven't told you what's actually happening inside that wound. Private Collins shifts in his bed, trying to get comfortable. The ward is full of similar cases, men with shrapnel wounds and burns and infections, all being treated with whatever's available. The windows are blacked out because of air raid precautions, so the only light comes from dim bulbs hanging from the ceiling. You can hear coughing from other beds, the occasional groan of pain, the soft footsteps of nurses moving between patients. The honey Margaret applied is creating an environment where bacteria can't survive. It's acidic enough to kill most pathogens. It draws moisture out of bacterial cells through osmosis, essentially dehydrating them to death. It contains hydrogen peroxide, produced by an enzyme the bees add, which acts as a natural antiseptic, and it's loaded with compounds from plants, propolis, flavonoids, phenolic acids, that have antimicrobial and anti-inflammatory properties. All of this happens without anyone understanding the biochemistry. They just know it works. 3 days later, you're back in the same ward. Private Collins is sitting up in bed, reading a letter from home. Margaret changes his dressing, and you see the wound. It's smaller, cleaner, pink tissue forming where dead tissue used to be. The smell of infection is gone, replaced by the faint sweet scent of honey. She smiles, satisfied, and writes another note on his chart. Continued improvement, honey dressing effective. Can you feel the relief in this room, knowing that something as simple as honey can save a life? The war will end eventually, antibiotics will become widely available, and slowly, gradually, hospitals will stop using honey because pharmaceutical companies will convince them that synthetic drugs are more reliable, more scientific, more modern. The knowledge of honey's healing properties will fade into folk medicine, dismissed as old wives' tales. But here, in 1943, in a blacked-out London hospital ward, honey is saving lives that pills and injections can't reach. Margaret moves on to the next patient, her shoes squeaking softly on the linoleum floor. The jar of honey sits on her supply cart, half empty, waiting for the next wound that needs healing. Outside you can hear the distant rumble of bombers, the war continuing its relentless grind. But in here, for this moment, one small victory has been won, with nothing more than what bees made from flowers. By morning, would anyone remember how medicine used to be this simple?
You're standing in a research laboratory at the University of Waikato in New Zealand, 1981. A biochemist named Dr. Peter Mullen is hunched over a petri dish, and his hands are trembling slightly with excitement. He's been testing different types of honey against various bacteria for months now, and what he's discovered is making him question everything he thought he knew about food science. The lab smells like agar and disinfectant, that clean chemical smell of scientific spaces. But on the counter beside him sits an open jar of dark, almost mahogany-colored honey from the manuka tree, and it's cutting through the sterility with something earthy and medicinal. Dr. Milan has just exposed cultures of Staphylococcus aureus to this honey, and the results are undeniable. The bacteria are dying, not slowly, not partially, completely. He makes notes in a leather-bound journal, his handwriting cramped and urgent. He's tested clover honey, orange blossom honey, wildflower honey from 3 different continents. They all have antibacterial properties, just like the medieval monks and World War II nurses observed. But this manuka honey is different. It's killing bacteria that are resistant to conventional antibiotics. It's working through mechanisms that don't rely solely on hydrogen peroxide or acidity. There's something else in it, something he'll eventually identify as methylglyoxal, a compound that makes manuka honey uniquely powerful. But I haven't told you what this discovery will unleash on the world. Dr. Milan leans back in his chair and rubs his eyes. It's past midnight, and he's been in the lab for 14 hours straight. Outside the window, the New Zealand darkness is complete. No city lights to interrupt it, just stars and silence. He looks at the petri dish again under the microscope, watching the bacterial colonies that should be thriving but are instead dying in concentric circles around the honey samples. It's beautiful in a strange way, this visible proof of something ancient and powerful. He thinks about the Maori people who've been using manuka honey for centuries, applying it to wounds and infections long before anyone had microscopes or petri dishes. They didn't need to understand methylglyoxal or osmotic pressure. They just knew it worked. And now, finally, Western science is catching up to what indigenous knowledge has held all along. Dr. Milan feels a mixture of excitement and humility. He's not discovering anything new, really. He's just confirming what bees and humans have known for thousands of years. The lab is quiet except for the hum of the refrigeration units keeping bacterial samples at precise temperatures. You can hear Dr. Milan's pen scratching across paper as he writes, documenting everything, knowing this research will eventually be published and scrutinized and replicated. He's meticulous because he has to be. The scientific establishment doesn't accept folk wisdom easily. You need data, control groups, statistical significance. Can you imagine sitting in this quiet lab, watching someone prove that medicine grew on trees and bees collected it? He closes his journal and stands, stretching muscles stiff from sitting. Tomorrow, he'll start testing manuka honey on other bacteria, Escherichia coli, Helicobacter pylori, Pseudomonas aeruginosa, all the pathogens that plague modern humans despite our arsenal of synthetic drugs. And he'll find that honey, this ancient substance that never spoils, has answers that pharmaceutical companies are still trying to synthesize in factories. But by the time his research becomes famous, something else will happen. Manuka honey will become a luxury product, marketed and trademarked and sold for hundreds of dollars per jar. The healing properties will be commodified, regulated, turned into a global industry worth billions. And regular, local, ordinary honey will be forgotten, dismissed as inferior because it doesn't have a medical-grade rating stamped on its label. Dr. Milan turns off the microscope and covers the petri dishes. The Manuka honey jar sits on the counter, still open, its dark contents catching the overhead lights. Tomorrow, it will save more bacteria cultures from thriving. Years from now, it will save human lives and hospitals that have finally remembered what medieval monks never forgot. You're in a supermarket in Phoenix, Arizona, 2019, standing in the honey aisle, and it's confusing. There are 40 different bottles and jars, all claiming to be honey, but the prices range from $3 to $60. Some say raw, some say pure, some say organic, some say Manuka, some say locally sourced, and some just say honey with a picture of a cheerful cartoon bear. A woman in her 30s stands beside you, phone in hand, trying to Google the difference. The fluorescent lights buzz overhead, creating that low-frequency hum that permeates every grocery store. The air conditioning is too cold, the way it always is in Arizona supermarkets, overcompensating for the desert heat outside. The woman picks up a plastic bear bottle, squints at the label, puts it down, picks up a glass jar labeled raw, unfiltered honey, reads the back, looks at the price, hesitates. She's trying to make a healthy choice, but the information is contradictory and overwhelming. The cheap bear bottle lists only one ingredient, honey. But if you look closer at the fine print, it says product of India, Argentina, and Vietnam. It's been shipped halfway around the world, blended in a facility in the Midwest, heated and filtered until it's unrecognizable. The expensive glass jar claims to be from a local beekeeper in Tucson, raw and unfiltered, with visible pollen and propolis. The price difference is 20 times higher. The woman does the math in her head, and you can see her struggling with it. But I haven't told you why this choice shouldn't be so complicated. She finally picks up a mid-priced option labeled organic honey and drops it in her cart. It's a compromise, an attempt to navigate between cheap and expensive, between uncertainty and broke. You watch her walk away, and you know she has no idea whether she just bought something that will help her health or harm it. The labeling regulations are loose. The term pure honey is nearly meaningless. Even organic honey can be ultra-filtered and heat processed until its beneficial compounds are destroyed. You pick up the cheap bear bottle and turn it over. The honey inside is perfectly clear, almost glowing under the fluorescent lights. It looks artificial, honestly, more like corn syrup than anything bees would make. You unscrew the cap and smell it. Sweet but flat. No floral notes, no complexity, no hint of the flowers the bees supposedly visited. Just sugar. You squeeze a tiny amount onto your finger and taste it. It dissolves instantly on your tongue, no thickness, no lingering flavor. This is what most Americans think honey tastes like. You put it back and pick up the expensive local jar. The honey inside is cloudy, with visible particles suspended throughout, and the color varies from light amber at the top to darker gold at the bottom. You open it and smell lavender, sage, maybe creosote bush, the desert plants that bloom after rain. The taste is completely different, complex, almost medicinal, with a thickness that coats your mouth. This is what Brother Thomas tasted in 1347. This is what saved Private Collins in 1943. This is what Dr. Milan studied under his microscope. Can you feel the disconnect between what honey should be and what most people are buying? The supermarket is busy now, carts rolling past, people grabbing items without reading labels, moving through their shopping lists efficiently. Most of them will grab the cheap bear because it's familiar, it's affordable, it's what they grew up with. They don't know that what they're buying barely qualifies as honey by historical standards. They don't know their grandparents ate something completely different. They don't know that processing has stripped away the very compounds that made honey valuable for thousands of years. You leave the honey aisle and walk toward the checkout, passing aisles of processed foods, refined sugars, artificial sweeteners. Everything optimized for shelf life and profit margins, nothing optimized for human health. The supermarket speakers are playing soft rock, something forgettable from the 1980s. Outside, the Phoenix sun is brutal, 110 degrees, the parking lot shimmering with heat waves. When you get home, which honey will actually be sitting in your cabinet? You're inside a human body now, microscopic, watching what happens when someone eats a spoonful of ultra-filtered commercial honey. The honey enters the mouth and immediately begins breaking down. Saliva contains enzymes, but there's not much for them to work with here. This honey is essentially just glucose and fructose, simple sugars that require almost no digestion. It tastes sweet for a moment, then it's gone, sliding down the esophagus in a quick, unremarkable journey. Within minutes, those simple sugars hit the bloodstream like a freight train. You're watching from inside a blood vessel now, seeing glucose molecules flood past at an alarming rate. The pancreas, sensing this sudden spike, releases a massive dose of insulin. It's an emergency response, the body trying desperately to get all this sugar out of the bloodstream before it causes damage. You can almost feel the stress of it, the metabolic scramble. The liver is working overtime now, converting excess glucose into fat because there's simply too much sugar to use immediately. The person who ate this honey might feel a brief surge of energy, but it's followed quickly by a crash as insulin drives their blood sugar down too fast. They'll feel hungry again within an hour, maybe tired, maybe irritable. Their body just experienced what's essentially a refined sugar rush, no different from eating candy. But I haven't told you what happens when that same person eats raw, unprocessed honey instead. You're back at the beginning, watching someone eat a spoonful of honey that still contains all its pollen, propolis, enzymes, and trace minerals. The difference starts immediately. The enzymes in raw honey, diastase, invertase, glucose oxidase, begin working in the mouth, pre-digesting some of the sugars before they even reach the stomach. The propolis, that sticky resin bees collect from trees, starts coating the throat with antimicrobial compounds. In the stomach, the honey behaves differently. It's thicker, more complex, releasing its sugars more slowly. The pollen grains contain proteins and lipids that slow absorption. The propolis contains flavonoids that modulate the body's inflammatory response. The trace minerals, magnesium, potassium, calcium, zinc, are actually bioavailable, unlike the synthetic versions added to processed foods. This honey isn't just calories, it's information, telling the body how to use it properly. When these sugars enter the bloodstream, the spike is gentler, more gradual. The pancreas responds with a measured insulin release, nothing frantic or excessive. The liver doesn't panic because the glucose arrives at a manageable rate. The person eating this honey will feel sustained energy for hours, not a brief spike and crash. They'll feel satisfied, not hungry. Their body just received nutrition, not just calories. Can you feel the difference between feeding your body and actually nourishing it? You're floating through the bloodstream now, watching those complex compounds from raw honey doing unexpected things. The antioxidants, phenolic acids, flavonoids, vitamin C are seeking out free radicals and neutralizing them before they can damage cells. The antimicrobial compounds are quietly killing off pathogens in the gut, maintaining a healthy microbiome. The anti-inflammatory compounds are reducing chronic inflammation throughout the body, that low-grade fire that causes so many modern diseases. In the gut, the prebiotics in raw honey are feeding beneficial bacteria, helping them thrive and multiply. These bacteria, in turn, are producing compounds that affect mood, immunity, digestion, even brain function. The person who ate this honey won't feel these effects immediately, but over time, over weeks and months of eating real honey instead of processed sugar, their entire system will shift toward health. You watch white blood cells moving through capillaries, and they seem more alert, more efficient when raw honey compounds are present. Studies will eventually show that raw honey boosts immune function, but right now, in this moment, you're just watching it happen at a cellular level. The body recognizes this food. It knows what to do with it. This is what humans have been eating for thousands of years, and our biology is optimized for it. But when that same person eats ultra-filtered honey, their body barely recognizes it as different from table sugar. The metabolic pathway is nearly identical. The insulin response is nearly identical. The inflammatory response is nearly identical. They might as well be eating corn syrup, and often they are, because many commercial honey products are adulterated with exactly that. The label says honey, but the body experiences sugar. By the time you return to normal size, standing in someone's kitchen watching them choose between jars, everything looks different. You're in rural France now, 1782, walking through the countryside outside Lyon with a natural philosopher named Antoine Augustin Parmentier. He's not famous yet, but he will be, mostly for promoting potatoes as food for peasants. Right now, though, he's obsessed with honey. He's carrying a leather-bound notebook and stopping at every wildflower to examine what the bees are doing. The air smells like sun-warmed grass and lavender, that specific scent of French countryside in summer. Bees are everywhere, moving from flower to flower with single-minded purpose. Parmentier kneels beside a patch of wild thyme, watching a bee collect pollen. Its legs are already loaded with bright yellow granules, packed into pollen baskets that look almost comically oversized. The bee moves with precision, knowing exactly which flowers to visit and in what order. Parmentier makes a sketch in his notebook, trying to capture the bee's anatomy, its behavior, the flowers it prefers. He's noticed that different bees visit different flowers, that they seem to have preferences based on what their hive needs. Some go for pollen, others for nectar. Some visit flowers in the morning, others in the afternoon. It's a complex system, far more sophisticated than most people realize. He writes, "The bee is a chemist of extraordinary skill, transforming flower essences into a substance that never decays." But I haven't told you what Parmentier is really trying to understand. He stands and continues walking, following a dirt path that winds between fields. In the distance, you can see a small farmhouse with bee skeps arranged in the garden, just like the ones at Brother Thomas's monastery 400 years earlier. Nothing has changed, really. Beekeeping is still done the same way, honey is still harvested the same way, and the honey itself is still raw, local, medicinal. Parmentier is interested in preservation. France is between famines, as it always seems to be, and he's looking for ways to keep food from spoiling. He's studied honey's preservation properties, how it can keep fruit edible through winter, how it can be mixed with herbs to create medicines that last for years. He's discovered that honey creates an environment hostile to bacteria and mold, though he doesn't have the vocabulary to explain why. He just knows it works. He reaches the farmhouse and knocks on the door. An elderly woman answers, wiping flour from her hands on her apron. Parmentier asks about her bees, and her face lights up. She invites him to the garden, where 10 skeps sit in a neat row. She explains that each hive produces different honey depending on the season. Spring honey, when the fruit trees bloom, is light and mild. Summer honey, when lavender and thyme dominate, is darker and more aromatic. Fall honey, when the bees gather from whatever flowers remain, is the darkest and strongest. Can you imagine living in a world where honey has terroir, where its flavor changes with the seasons like wine? The woman offers Parmentier a taste of her summer honey, scooping it directly from a clay jar with a wooden spoon. He tastes it slowly, analytically, trying to identify the flowers. Lavender, definitely. Thyme, certainly. Something else, something peppery, maybe wild rosemary. The complexity amazes him. This isn't just sweetness, it's a complete sensory experience, a map of the landscape captured in liquid form. He asks if she ever heats the honey or strains it through fine cloth. She looks at him like he suggested setting fire to her house. Why would anyone do that? Heating honey destroys its properties. Everyone knows that. Straining out the pollen and wax removes the medicine. You'd be left with nothing but sweet liquid, useless for healing, barely worth eating. Parmentier nods, making more notes. The peasants understand what educated people are starting to forget. He thanks the woman and continues his walk, his notebook now filled with observations and sketches. The sun is lower now, casting long shadows across the fields. Bees are returning to their hives, their day's work done, carrying pollen and nectar that will become honey overnight through enzymatic transformation. Parmentier watches them and thinks about chemistry, about preservation, about the intersection of nature and human need. By the time he returns to Lyon, he'll write a treatise on honey's medicinal properties, but it will be largely ignored by the medical establishment. You're in a modern endocrinologist's office in Seattle, 2023, and Dr. Sarah Kim is explaining to a patient why his blood sugar levels have been erratic despite eating healthy honey every morning. The patient, a man in his 50s named Robert, looks confused. He switched from white sugar to honey 6 months ago because he read it was better for you, natural, wholesome, the kind of thing you see on Instagram wellness accounts with millions of followers. Dr. Kim pulls up his glucose monitor data on her computer screen, and you can see the spikes. Every morning around 8 a.m., a sharp rise that looks exactly like what happens when someone eats candy or drinks soda. Robert leans forward, squinting at the graph, trying to understand what went wrong. He bought the expensive honey, the kind in the glass jar with the pretty label. He thought he was making a good choice. She asks him to bring the honey jar to his next appointment, and he does. You're there when he places it on her desk a week later. Dr. Kim picks it up, turns it over, reads the label carefully. Pure honey, it says. Product of Brazil, India, and Vietnam. Ultra-filtered for clarity and smooth texture. She sighs, and you can tell she's had this conversation before. This isn't honey in any meaningful sense. It's been so processed that it's functionally identical to high-fructose corn syrup. But I haven't told you how the honey industry ended up here. Dr. Kim explains that ultra-filtering removes all the pollen, which is actually what makes honey traceable and authentic. Without pollen, honey can be sourced from anywhere, blended with cheap syrups, and sold as pure. The heating process destroys the enzymes that slow sugar absorption. What Robert's been eating every morning is essentially liquid sugar with honey flavoring. His body treats it exactly like the refined sugar he was trying to avoid. Robert looks deflated. He spent 6 months thinking he was improving his health, but his hemoglobin A1C has actually increased. His insulin resistance has gotten worse. His inflammation markers are elevated, all because he trusted a label that said pure and a price point that seemed reasonable. Dr. Kim recommends he try genuinely raw, local honey instead, but warns him it will be expensive and harder to find. She also suggests he might just want to avoid sweeteners altogether for a while. The office is quiet except for the hum of the computer and the distant sound of traffic outside. Robert sits there processing this information, and you can see him mentally calculating how much money he's wasted on fake honey. More than that, though, he's realizing how hard it is to make informed choices when the food industry has deliberately made everything confusing. The labels lie, the marketing lies, even the texture and appearance lie. Can you imagine trying to heal yourself and accidentally making things worse because you trusted the wrong jar? Dr. Kim prints out a list of questions Robert should ask when buying honey. Does it crystallize? Real honey does. Does it have visible particles? Real honey should. Where exactly did the bees forage? Real honey can tell you. Has it been heated above 95 degrees? Real honey hasn't been. Can you visit the beekeeper? Real honey comes from someone local enough to meet. Most honey sold in supermarkets will fail all these tests. Robert folds the paper and puts it in his pocket. He looks older than he did an hour ago, tired in a way that has nothing to do with sleep. He's just learned that one of the world's oldest foods has been turned into an industrial product designed to maximize profit rather than health. He's learned that ancient doesn't mean safe anymore, that traditional doesn't mean authentic, that natural has been legally redefined to mean almost nothing. You watch him leave the office, and you wonder how many other people are eating processed honey believing it's medicine when it's actually contributing to their metabolic dysfunction. How many diabetics are spiking their blood sugar with healthy honey? How many parents are feeding it to their children thinking it's better than sugar? How many wellness influencers are promoting brands that paid them without understanding what's actually in the jar? The answer, unfortunately, is millions. You're standing in a massive warehouse in China, 2018, watching something that shouldn't exist. Workers are mixing huge vats of syrup made from rice, corn, and sugar beets with just enough real honey to pass certain tests. The ratio is roughly 70% cheap syrup, 30% honey, but after ultra-filtering to remove pollen, it's nearly impossible to detect the fraud. This adulterated honey will be shipped to the United States, Europe, Australia, and sold as pure honey for a fraction of what real honey costs. The warehouse smells sweet, cloying, artificial. Nothing like the complex floral scent of real honey. Massive industrial mixers are churning thousands of gallons at a time, creating a product that looks like honey, pours like honey, and tastes vaguely like honey, but isn't honey at all. It's one of the most sophisticated food frauds in history, costing the legitimate honey industry hundreds of millions of dollars annually and flooding the market with something that's worse than useless. A quality control manager walks past with a clipboard, checking viscosity and color. He's not checking for authenticity. He's checking that the fake honey looks consistent enough to pass as real. The company knows exactly what it's doing. They've calibrated the blend to avoid detection by most standard tests. Only sophisticated nuclear magnetic resonance testing can definitively prove it's fake, and almost no one uses that because it's expensive. But I haven't told you why this matters beyond just fraud. When someone buys this fake honey thinking it's real, they're getting none of the benefits that made honey valuable for thousands of years. No antimicrobial properties, no antioxidants, no enzymes, no pollen, no propolis, no trace minerals, just empty calories that spike blood sugar and contribute to obesity, diabetes, and metabolic syndrome. They might as well eat spoonfuls of corn syrup, and in fact, that's essentially what they're doing. The workers load pallets of this fake honey onto shipping containers. Each container holds thousands of bottles and jars, all labeled with various brand names you'd recognize from grocery stores. Some will be sold as cheap commodity honey. Others will be relabeled and upscaled, sold in fancy jars with words like artisan and pure and natural. The markup is enormous. The profit margins are staggering, and it's all technically legal because enforcement is minimal and penalties are negligible. You watch a forklift move another pallet toward the loading dock. The driver is listening to music through earbuds, completely unconcerned with what he's transporting. To him, it's just another day at work. He doesn't think about the person in Seattle buying this honey for their sick child. He doesn't think about the diabetic trying to make healthier choices. He doesn't think about the medieval monks who would have considered this sacrilege. Can you feel the betrayal of trust that's happening in this warehouse? The shipping containers are loaded onto trucks, then trains, then massive cargo ships that will cross the Pacific. The journey takes weeks, but the product doesn't spoil because it's mostly synthetic to begin with. By the time it reaches American ports, customs officials will perform random inspections, but they're looking for contaminants and incorrect paperwork, not sophisticated fraud. Most of these containers will pass through without issue. Within months, this fake honey will be sitting on shelves next to real honey, priced competitively, sometimes even cheaper. Consumers trying to make healthy choices will have no way to tell the difference without laboratory equipment. The label will say honey. The ingredient list will say honey. But what's inside the jar is something that didn't exist before the industrial age, something bees would never make, something that helps no one except the people profiting from the deception. Back in the warehouse, the mixers continue churning. The recipe has been perfected over years of trial and error. Add too much syrup and it fails the moisture test. Add too little honey and the flavor is wrong. But get the blend just right and you can fool almost everyone almost all the time. The warehouse operates 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, producing more fake honey than many countries produce real honey. By morning, another shipment will be ready to deceive millions of people who just want something sweet and natural. You're sitting in a small kitchen in Vermont, 2021, watching a beekeeper named Tom Seeley examine his harvest. He's in his 70s now, been keeping bees for 50 years, and he's looking at 3 jars of honey from the same apiary, harvested at different times. Spring honey, pale and delicate. Summer honey, rich and amber. Fall honey, dark as whiskey. Each one tells a story about what bloomed and when. The kitchen smells like wood smoke from the fireplace and something baking in the oven. Tom's wife is making bread, and the yeast is mingling with the honey scent in a way that makes you hungry. Tom unscrews the lid on the spring honey and tilts the jar toward the window. Afternoon light passes through it, revealing suspended particles that dance when he moves the jar. Pollen grains, tiny flecks of wax, the visible proof that this honey is exactly what bees made. He dips a spoon in and tastes it, closing his eyes to concentrate. Apple blossom, he says. Cherry. Maybe some dandelion. His bees foraged in an orchard a quarter-mile from here, and you can taste the place in the honey. It's light, floral, barely sweet compared to store-bought honey. He explains that early spring honey has lower sugar content because the nectar is more diluted. The bees work harder for it, visiting more flowers to fill their stomachs. But I haven't told you why Tom is one of the last beekeepers doing it this way. He opens the summer jar next, and immediately the room smells different. Fuller, richer, more complex. This honey is darker, thicker, and when he tastes it, you can see his expression change. Clover, he says. Definitely clover, with some black locust and maybe basswood. This honey came from bees working the meadows when the weather was hot and flowers were abundant. The sugar content is higher, the flavor is more concentrated. This is the honey people think of when they imagine honey. Tom sells his honey at the local farmer's market for $15 per pound, and even at that price, he barely breaks even. The cost of maintaining hives, buying equipment, extracting honey by hand, and bottling in small batches makes it nearly impossible to compete with industrial operations. He does it because he loves bees, because he believes in real food, because someone needs to remember how honey is supposed to be made. But he's tired, and his children have no interest in continuing. You watch him label a jar by hand, writing Summer 2021, Howell saying, Clover in neat cursive. He uses a fountain pen because ballpoint seems wrong somehow for this task. Each jar gets dated, sourced, and signed. He knows the person who buys this honey will probably never appreciate how much work went into it. They'll spread it on toast without thinking about the 10,000 flower visits required to make a single pound. They'll finish the jar in a month and forget about it. Can you imagine pouring your life into something most people consume without a second thought? The fall honey is last. Tom opens it, and the smell is almost medicinal, earthy and strong. Goldenrod, he says. Aster, end-of-season flowers that bloom when everything else is dying. This honey is the darkest, the least sweet, the most nutritious. It's also the hardest to sell because people expect honey to be golden and mild. They think dark honey is inferior when actually it's the opposite. Dark honey has more antioxidants, more minerals, more medicinal compounds. But marketing has trained people to prefer the light stuff. He sets all 3 jars on the counter in a row, and you can see the gradient from pale gold to deep amber to almost brown. 3 seasons, 3 flavors, 3 completely different honeys from the same bees in the same location. This is what honey used to be before industrial processing homogenized everything. This is what the medieval monks tasted, what the Victorian nurses used, what Dr. Milan's.
You're in a laboratory at the University of Illinois, 2015, watching a food scientist named Dr. Vaughan Bryant examine honey samples under a high-powered microscope. He's been studying honey fraud for 20 years, and what he's found is worse than anyone suspected. Out of 60 honey samples purchased from major US grocery chains, more than 75% contained no pollen at all. Not filtered honey, not processed honey, something else entirely. The lab is cold, temperature controlled for sensitive equipment. Dr. Bryant moves from slide to slide, shaking his head. Each sample should contain thousands of pollen grains per gram, a microscopic fingerprint of where the bees foraged. Instead, he's seeing nothing. Clear, empty, devoid of any biological markers, this honey has been ultra-filtered to remove all evidence of origin, which means it could be from anywhere, could be anything, could be completely fake. He pulls up a database on his computer and cross-references the samples with known honey profiles. Real orange blossom honey from Florida should have specific pollen from citrus trees and associated wildflowers. This sample, labelled orange blossom honey, has none. Real clover honey from the Midwest should have trifolium pollen in specific concentrations. This sample, labelled clover honey, has none. He's not just looking at processed honey, he's looking at a systematic substitution of real food with industrial counterfeit. But I haven't told you who's responsible and why they're getting away with it. Dr. Bryant leans back and rubs his temples. He's published papers on this, testified before Congress, given interviews to major news outlets. Nothing changes. The honey keeps flowing into the country, mostly from China, ultra-filtered to hide its origin, sometimes adulterated with corn syrup or rice syrup, sold to major brands who either don't know or don't care. The FDA has limited resources, and honey fraud is low priority compared to contaminated meat or dangerous drugs. He pulls out a file folder thick with documentation. Letters from beekeepers who've gone out of business because they can't compete with $2 bottles of honey that cost less to produce than their glass jars. Reports from labs in Europe that have caught the same frauds but can't stop the imports. Chemical analyses showing that some honey samples are literally impossible, containing pollen from plants that don't even grow in the regions listed on the label. The most disturbing finding is the health impact. Dr. Bryant has traced diabetes clusters to communities with high consumption of ultra-processed honey. The correlation isn't perfect, but it's suggestive. People think they're eating a natural sweetener with health benefits. Instead, they're consuming industrial syrup that spikes blood sugar faster than table sugar. They're being poisoned slowly by something labelled as medicine. Can you imagine the cumulative harm of millions of people eating fake honey every single day? He receives emails from consumers sometimes, people who figured out something was wrong. Their honey doesn't crystallize, their honey tastes bland, their honey doesn't help their allergies despite claims about local pollen. They ask him which brands to trust, and he has to tell them the truth. Unless you personally know the beekeeper, you're probably buying fake honey. The major brands, the organic brands, the premium brands, all vulnerable to the same fraud because they source from global suppliers who cut corners. Dr. Bryant closes the file and looks at the microscope again. Each empty slide represents a small betrayal, a broken trust between consumer and food system. Multiply that by billions of jars sold annually, and you have one of the largest food frauds in human history. It's not killing people immediately like contaminated meat or toxic additives. It's just slowly, quietly contributing to metabolic disease while pretending to be health food. He saves his data and shuts down the microscope. Tomorrow he'll test more samples, document more fraud, add more evidence to a pile that no one in power seems interested in addressing. The Honey Industry Association knows about the problem but lacks enforcement authority. The FDA knows, but prioritizes other issues. Customs knows, but can't test every shipment. The fraud continues because it's profitable, and the penalties are minimal. Outside the lab window, the Illinois prairie is turning gold in the late afternoon sun. Real bees are out there somewhere, visiting real flowers, making real honey that will be outcompeted by fake honey in stores. The economic incentive structure is completely backward. Being honest costs more than cheating. Producing real food costs more than faking it. By evening, thousands more jars of counterfeit honey will be sold to people who trust the label. You're standing in a hospital burn unit in Mumbai 2017, watching Dr. Priya Sharma apply medical-grade honey to a patient's severe burns. The patient, a young woman named Anjali, was injured in a kitchen fire 3 weeks ago. Traditional treatments weren't working, and the infection was spreading. Dr. Sharma decided to try something her grandmother used to do, something the medical establishment had mostly forgotten. The burn unit smells like antiseptic, and something else, something human and damaged that no amount of cleaning can mask. Dr. Sharma unwraps Anjali's dressings carefully, revealing angry red tissue that should be healing but isn't. The infection has created a biofilm, a protective layer that makes bacteria nearly impossible to kill with conventional antibiotics. She's tried 3 different antibiotic regimens. Nothing worked. The infection just adapted, grew stronger, threatened to go systemic. She opens a jar of medical-grade Manuka honey, imported from New Zealand at considerable expense. The honey is thick, dark, certified for sterility but not heat processed. It still contains all the compounds that make honey medicinal: methyl glyoxal, hydrogen peroxide, B-defensin 1, and dozens of other substances that pharmaceutical companies have tried and failed to synthesize. Dr. Sharma spreads it directly onto the burn, a generous layer that covers the entire wound. But I haven't told you why she's willing to risk her reputation on something that seems like folk medicine. Anjali winces but doesn't cry out. The honey stings at first, that hydrogen peroxide activating, killing bacteria on contact, but within minutes, the stinging fades to a warm, pulling sensation. The honey is drawing moisture from the infected tissue, dehydrating the bacteria, making it impossible for them to survive. It's also creating an acidic environment, dropping the pH to levels where biofilms can't maintain their structure, and it's releasing those complex antimicrobial compounds that work through mechanisms antibiotics can't match. Dr. Sharma wraps the wound in clean gauze and makes notes on Anjali's chart. Honey dressing applied, 14-0. She's documenting carefully because if this works, she wants evidence. If it fails, she wants to know why. The hospital administration was skeptical when she proposed this treatment, but they're desperate. Antibiotic-resistant infections are killing people in this hospital every week. If honey can help even a fraction of cases, it's worth trying. 3 days later, you're back in the same room. Dr. Sharma is changing Anjali's dressing, and her hands are moving faster, more confidently. When she peels back the gauze, you can see the difference immediately. The angry redness has faded, the infection smell is gone. Pink, healthy tissue is forming at the edges of the burn. The biofilm has broken down, the bacteria are dying. Something that medieval monks knew intuitively, and Dr. Molan proved scientifically, is saving this woman's life. Can you imagine how strange it must feel to use ancient medicine in a modern hospital? Anjali is smiling for the first time since you've seen her. She asks Dr. Sharma what's in the honey that makes it work so well, and Dr. Sharma has to admit she doesn't fully understand. The research is still emerging. They know methyl glyoxal concentration matters. They know processing destroys effectiveness. They know some honeys work better than others, but the complete mechanism remains mysterious, a complexity that resists pharmaceutical simplification. Within 2 weeks, Anjali's burns are healing properly. The infection is completely cleared. She'll have scars, but they'll be smaller than expected, and she'll keep her arm, which was uncertain 2 weeks ago. Dr. Sharma documents everything, takes photographs for a case study, starts using honey on other difficult wounds. Word spreads through the hospital. Other doctors start asking questions, requesting access to her medical-grade honey supply. But there's a problem. The honey costs approximately $150 per jar, and she needs multiple jars per patient. The hospital can't afford to treat everyone this way. The insurance companies won't reimburse honey treatments because they're not standard of care, so Dr. Sharma has to choose which patients get the honey and which get conventional treatments that might not work. It's an impossible choice, rationing medicine that grows on trees because the economics of modern healthcare don't account for it. You watch her walk through the burn unit, checking on patients, knowing that some of them will die from infections that honey could cure. The irony is suffocating. Humanity has access to a natural antibiotic that works against resistant bacteria, that costs pennies for bees to make, that's been used successfully for thousands of years. But the modern medical system can't figure out how to integrate it because it doesn't fit the pharmaceutical model. You can't patent honey. You can't synthesize it. You can't control it. Dr. Sharma sits in her small office after rounds, writing up Anjali's case study. She knows it will be published in a minor journal that few people read. She knows it won't change policy or practice at scale. She knows that tomorrow another patient will arrive with resistant infections, and she'll have to decide whether they're sick enough to justify the expensive honey treatment. By the time she goes home, the sun has set over Mumbai, and somewhere in New Zealand, bees are making medicine that most of the world can't afford. You're in ancient Egypt now, 2400 BCE, standing in a tomb being prepared for a nobleman. Artists are painting hieroglyphs on the walls, and one entire section is dedicated to beekeeping scenes. Men smoking hives, collecting honey, pouring it into jars. The images are detailed, reverent, suggesting that honey is important enough to accompany someone into the afterlife. And in the corner of the tomb, you see them, actual jars of honey, sealed with wax, meant to sustain the dead man's car through eternity. The tomb smells like limestone dust and paint, pigments made from crushed minerals mixed with, you notice now, honey as a binder. Everything in this space is designed to last forever, and honey plays multiple roles. Food for the afterlife, medicine for the journey, preservative for other offerings, and ingredient in the paints and unguents that cover the walls. The Egyptians understand something about honey that modern people have forgotten. It's not just a sweetener, It's a fundamental technology. You watch a priest place the last honey jar near the sarcophagus. He's chanting something in Old Egyptian, words you can't understand but whose meaning is clear from his tone. Respect, reverence, gratitude. This honey represents thousands of hours of bee labour, dozens of flowering seasons, the concentrated essence of the Nile Delta's bloom. It's too valuable to waste, too sacred to treat casually. But I haven't told you what archaeologists will find when they open this tomb 3,000 years later. Fast forward to 1922. British archaeologist Howard Carter is opening sealed tombs in the Valley of the Kings. In one tomb, he finds honey jars that have been sealed for over 3 millennia. His team carefully opens one, expecting to find crystallized residue or dried paste. Instead, they find honey. Liquid, golden, perfectly preserved honey that looks and smells exactly like it did when it was sealed. Some members of the excavation team reportedly taste it. It's still sweet, still edible, still fundamentally unchanged after 3,000 years in darkness. This is honey's true miracle. It never spoils. The high sugar content, the low moisture, the acidic pH, the hydrogen peroxide, the antimicrobial compounds, all of these factors combine to create something that defies time. Bacteria can't grow in it, mold can't colonize it, yeast can't ferment it unless it's deliberately diluted. Honey is biologically stable in ways that almost no other food can match. You could eat honey made by bees during the reign of Tutankhamun, and it would nourish you exactly as it nourished him. Can you imagine any modern processed food lasting 3,000 years? You're back in the tomb now, watching it being sealed. Workers are rolling a massive stone across the entrance, and the light is fading. The last thing you see before darkness takes over is that honey jar, sitting peacefully next to offerings of bread that will rot, meat that will desiccate, beer that will evaporate. Only the honey will remain unchanged, waiting in perfect preservation for archaeologists who won't be born for 3,000 years. The Egyptians knew this, of course. They deliberately chose honey for tombs because they knew it was eternal. They saw it as a bridge between life and death, between temporary and permanent, between mortal and divine. The god Ra was said to have created bees from his tears. The goddess Neith was associated with beekeeping. Honey appeared in religious texts, medical papyri, and administrative records as both commodity and sacred substance. Egyptian physicians used honey to treat wounds, burns, cataracts, and digestive problems. The Ebers Papyrus, a medical text from 1550 BCE, lists over 500 remedies, and honey appears in almost a third of them. It's mixed with oil for burns, with milk for digestive issues, with various herbs for infections. The physicians don't understand the biochemistry, but they've had thousands of years to observe what works. Honey works. You watch scribes in another room preparing administrative documents, recording honey production from temple apiaries. The numbers are staggering. Tens of thousands of pounds annually, distributed to priests, physicians, artists, and administrators. Honey is currency, salary, offering, and medicine all at once. An entire economy partially runs on what bees make from flowers. It's renewable, sustainable, impossible to counterfeit, because everyone knows what real honey tastes like. By the time you leave ancient Egypt, returning to the present, you understand something crucial. Humans have always known honey was precious. For thousands of years, across every civilization, honey was treated with respect. It was expensive, yes, but that expense reflected its value. No one would have thought to process it, filter it, dilute it, fake it. The very idea would have seemed insane. So what changed? When did humanity decide that honey should be cheap, clear, convenient, and essentially fake? You're in a corporate boardroom in Chicago, 1972, watching executives from a major food company discuss their honey line. Sales are declining because imported honey from Argentina and Mexico costs half what domestic honey costs. The executives are looking at spreadsheets, profit margins, market share projections. Nobody in this room has ever kept bees. Nobody has visited an apiary. They're looking at honey as a commodity problem, not a food. The boardroom smells like coffee and cologne and the faint mustiness of old carpeting. Charts are projected on the walls showing consumer preferences. Consumers want honey that pours easily, doesn't crystallize, looks uniformly golden, and costs less than $3 per bottle. The problem is, real honey doesn't naturally do most of those things. Real honey crystallizes because that's what glucose does over time. Real honey varies in color and consistency because bees visit different flowers. Real honey costs more than $3 because beekeeping is labor-intensive. The head of product development stands up and pitches a solution: ultrafiltration. By heating the honey to 160 degrees and forcing it through microscopic filters, they can remove all the pollen, wax, and propolis that cause crystallization and color variation. The result will be a clear, stable product that meets consumer expectations. It will pour smoothly year-round. It will have indefinite shelf life. It will look perfect in the bottle. But I haven't told you what this executive knows about the consequences and simply doesn't care about. Someone asks about nutrition. The head of product development waves it away. Consumers buy honey for sweetness, not nutrition. Nobody's eating honey for its antimicrobial properties or antioxidants. They want it on their toast, in their tea, maybe for baking. The processing won't affect sweetness. That's all that matters in terms of sales. The fact that ultra-filtering removes everything that makes honey medicinally valuable is irrelevant to the business case. The CEO nods approvingly. This is exactly the kind of innovation that increases margins. Raw honey costs $4 per pound wholesale. After processing, they can blend it with cheaper imported honey, maybe even add corn syrup if they're careful about ratios, and sell the same volume for higher profit. They can undercut domestic beekeepers who refuse to process their honey. They can dominate the market through price competition, and consumers will thank them for making honey better. You watch them vote on the proposal. It passes unanimously. Within 6 months, this company's honey will be ultra-filtered, heat-processed, and blended with imported honey from countries that don't have strict regulations. Within 5 years, their competitors will follow suit because they'll have no choice. The market will shift toward processed honey as the standard. Real honey will become a niche product for health food stores and farmers markets. Can you feel the moment when food becomes product, when nourishment becomes commodity? The executives pack up their papers and leave for lunch. They're celebrating the decision, confident they've solved a business problem. None of them think about the beekeepers who'll go out of business. None of them think about the consumers who'll lose access to real honey without knowing it. None of them think about the public health implications of replacing medicine with sugar. They think about quarterly earnings, shareholder value, market position. You stay in the empty boardroom, looking at the charts still projected on the wall. Consumer preference data, all of it shaped by decades of marketing that taught people to expect honey that doesn't look like honey, doesn't behave like honey, doesn't nourish like honey. The food industry created these preferences through advertising, then used them to justify processing that strips away value while cutting costs. It's a perfect closed loop of manufactured demand and degraded supply. One chart shows projected savings from switching to imported honey, $2 and $3 million annually. Another shows projected increase in market share, 15% over 3 years. A third shows consumer satisfaction scores, which are expected to rise because the processed honey will better match what advertising has taught consumers to want. Every number points toward profit. No number measures what's being lost. Outside the boardroom windows, Chicago spreads out below, millions of people who will soon be eating processed honey without realizing anything changed. The labels will still say pure honey. The bottles will still have pictures of bees and flowers. The marketing will still use words like natural and wholesome, but the substance inside will be fundamentally different from what humans have eaten for thousands of years. By the time you leave the building, the decision has already rippled out into the world, changing supply chains, bankrupting beekeepers, and transforming honey from medicine into candy. You're in a small apartment in Brooklyn, 2024, watching a woman named Lisa research honey on her laptop at 11 p.m. She can't sleep, partly because of anxiety, and partly because she just learned that the honey she's been feeding her kids might be fake. She's clicking through articles, scientific studies, Reddit threads, trying to understand what's real and what's marketing. The blue light from her screen is the only illumination in the dark room. Her kitchen cabinet contains 4 different honey products. A plastic bear from the supermarket, $4.99 for 12 ounces. A glass jar labeled raw and unfiltered from Whole Foods, $12.99 for 8 ounces. A squeeze bottle from Trader Joe's, $5.99 for 16 ounces. And a small jar from a farmer's market, $18 for 6 ounces, with a handwritten label that says Wildflower Honey, June 2024, Sullivan County. She's trying to figure out which one is actually honey. The apartment is quiet except for the refrigerator humming and occasional traffic sounds from the street below. Lisa's husband is asleep. Her 2 kids are asleep. She should be asleep, but she's down a rabbit hole of food fraud, pesticide contamination, fake organic certifications, and the realization that almost nothing in her kitchen is what the label claims. The honey is just the latest betrayal, but somehow it hits harder because she thought honey was simple, pure, impossible to fake. But I haven't told you what she's learning that's keeping her awake. She's reading about pollen analysis, about how real honey should contain pollen that matches the floral source on the label. She learns that ultra-filtering removes all pollen specifically to hide the honey's origin. She reads about honey laundering, where Chinese honey is shipped to other countries to get new documentation before entering the US. She discovers that some honey contains antibiotics, heavy metals, and pesticide residues that aren't tested for at the border. Lisa picks up the plastic bear and reads the label again. Pure honey. It says, but the fine print lists countries of origin, product of India, Vietnam, and Argentina. She Googles each country and learns about their honey industries, about lax regulations and contamination problems, and the economic incentives to adulterate. She reads a study showing that 76% of honey sold in US grocery stores contains no pollen, suggesting ultrafiltration or complete fraud. She opens the bear and squeezes a drop onto her finger. It's thin, almost watery, dissolving on her tongue instantly with a one-dimensional sweetness. No floral notes, no complexity, no lingering flavor. She opens the expensive farmer's market jar and tastes that next. The difference is shocking. This honey is thick, coating her mouth, releasing flavors slowly. Wildflowers, something slightly bitter, something almost medicinal. It doesn't dissolve, it sits on her tongue demanding attention. Can you imagine realizing that what you thought was food was actually just flavored syrup? Lisa does the crystallization test she read about. She puts a spoonful of each honey in separate small containers and places them in the refrigerator. Real honey should crystallize within days or weeks, depending on its glucose to fructose ratio. Fake honey won't crystallize at all. She sets a reminder on her phone to check them in 3 days. She knows the result will probably make her angry, but she needs to know. She clicks through more articles, finding one about children's health and sugar consumption. The average American child consumes 17 teaspoons of added sugar daily, far above recommended limits. She's been using honey instead of sugar in her kids' oatmeal, thinking it's healthier. Now she realizes the processed honey is metabolically identical to table sugar. She's been giving them sugar while calling it honey, patting herself on the back for making healthy choices. The clock reads 12 p.m. 37 a.m. now. Lisa should close the laptop and sleep, but she's calculating how much fake honey her family has consumed over the years. Hundreds of jars, probably. Thousands of dollars spent on products that weren't what they claimed to be. And the health impact, blood sugar spikes, insulin resistance, inflammation, all while thinking they were eating something natural and beneficial. She makes a shopping list for tomorrow. Visit the farmer's market, talk to actual beekeepers, ask questions about processing and sourcing. Stop buying honey from stores unless she can verify authenticity. Maybe buy a refractometer to test moisture content. Maybe learn about crystallization patterns and pollen identification. It seems absurd that buying honey requires this much investigation, but here she is at nearly 1 a.m., becoming an amateur honey forensics expert. By the time she finally closes her laptop, she's made a decision. Her family will eat less honey, but when they do eat it, it will be real. You're in a meadow in Montana, late afternoon in July, watching a single bee work a patch of wild bergamot. The bee is meticulous, systematic, visiting each flower for precisely the right amount of time before moving to the next. She's covered in pollen, bright orange grains clinging to the hairs on her body. Her pollen baskets are already full, but she's collecting nectar now, filling her honey stomach with liquid that weighs almost as much as she does. The meadow smells like sun-warmed grass and bergamot, that minty citrus scent that makes the air feel cleaner somehow. Other bees are working nearby, each one independent but part of the same collective effort. They're not competing, they're not rushing, they're just working. The way bees have worked for 50 million years, turning flowers into food with an efficiency that no human technology has ever matched. This one bee will visit between 50 and 100 flowers on this trip. She'll fly up to 3 miles from her hive, navigating by the sun and landmarks and some internal compass humans don't fully understand. When her honey stomach is full, she'll fly home and regurgitate the nectar to house bees, who will begin the transformation process. They'll add enzymes that break down complex sugars. They'll fan their wings to evaporate excess moisture. They'll move the developing honey from cell to cell, concentrating it, perfecting it. But I haven't told you how many bees it takes to make the honey in a single jar. A bee's entire lifetime of foraging produces about 1/12 of a teaspoon of honey. Think about that. This bee you're watching, who will live for only 6 weeks during the busy summer season, will produce less honey than you can balance on your fingertip. To make 1 pound of honey requires about 2 million flower visits by thousands of bees, flying a combined distance of over 55,000 miles. The honey in that cheap plastic bear represents more work than most humans will do in a year. You follow this bee back to her hive, a wild colony living in a hollow tree at the edge of the meadow. She lands on the entrance board and immediately begins communicating with other foragers through a waggle dance, telling them exactly where the bergamot patch is, how far, in what direction, how rich the nectar. Other bees watch her dance and memorize the information. Within minutes, more foragers are heading to the same flowers. Inside the hive, the temperature is precisely regulated at 95 degrees Fahrenheit. Thousands of bees are working in perfect coordination, without any central authority. Some are building comb from wax they secrete from glands in their abdomens. Some are tending larvae, feeding them royal jelly or bee bread, depending on what caste they're destined for. Some are processing nectar into honey. Some are guarding the entrance. Some are removing dead bees and debris. It's a city of 30,000 individuals functioning as a single superorganism. Can you imagine organizing 30,000 anything without language, without written rules, without hierarchy? The bee you followed passes her nectar to a house bee who begins the enzymatic process. The house bee adds invertase, an enzyme that breaks sucrose into glucose and fructose. She adds glucose oxidase, which will eventually produce the hydrogen peroxide that keeps honey sterile. She works the nectar in her mouth, mixing it with more enzymes, reducing the water content, concentrating the sugars. Then she deposits it in a cell and moves on to process more nectar. Over the next few days, other bees will continue processing this nectar. They'll fan their wings constantly, creating airflow that evaporates water. The moisture content will drop from 80% to below 18%, the critical threshold where bacteria and yeast can't survive. When the honey reaches perfect ripeness, bees will cap the cell with wax, sealing it for long-term storage. The hive is preparing for winter, for the months when no flowers bloom, when the colony must survive on stored honey. You watch this process repeat thousands of times, foragers returning with nectar and pollen, house bees processing, storing, capping, the comb filling slowly with honey that ranges from pale gold to dark amber, depending on what flowers the foragers found. Each cell is a tiny time capsule, preserving a moment of summer bloom in a form that will last decades if left undisturbed. The sun is setting now, and foragers are returning to the hive for the night. The guard bees are becoming more vigilant, checking every bee that enters to make sure it belongs to this colony. Inside, the cluster is forming, thousands of bees pressing together to maintain temperature through the cool night. Tomorrow they'll do it all again, and the day after, and every day until frost kills the flowers and winter forces them into dormancy. This is what commercial beekeeping interrupts. This is what industrial honey production exploits. This is what humans have decided to commodify and optimize and process until it barely resembles what the bees made. By morning, the meadow will be covered in dew, and the bees will wait for the sun to dry the flowers before beginning their work again. You're in a conference room at the FDA headquarters in Maryland, 2016, listening to a meeting about honey standards. Representatives from the honey industry are here, along with consumer advocates, beekeepers, and government regulators. They're discussing whether to establish a legal definition of honey that would prevent ultra-filtered products from being labeled as honey. The tension in the room is palpable. The conference room is aggressively beige, beige walls, beige carpet, beige table. Fluorescent lights hum overhead, creating that flat institutional lighting that makes everyone look slightly ill. An industry representative in an expensive suit is arguing that ultrafiltration is necessary for product stability and consumer preference. He has PowerPoint slides showing market research, focus group data, sales figures. Consumers want honey that doesn't crystallize, he says. They want consistency. They want convenience. A beekeeper from Iowa stands up, and his hands are shaking with barely controlled anger. He's been keeping bees for 40 years, and he's watched the market systematically devalue real honey. He can't compete with imported, ultra-filtered honey that sells for less than his production costs. He's going out of business, like thousands of other small beekeepers. He wants the FDA to require that honey contain pollen, that it not be heated above 95 degrees, that it be traceable to specific geographic origins. But I haven't told you how this meeting will end, and why nothing will change. A consumer advocate presents data on honey fraud, showing that up to 70% of honey sold in the US may be adulterated or mislabeled. She talks about public health concerns, about children consuming fake honey thinking it's natural. She talks about economic harm to legitimate beekeepers. She talks about consumer deception. Her presentation is thorough, well-researched, backed by peer-reviewed studies. The FDA representatives take notes but say nothing. The industry representative counters that establishing strict honey standards would increase costs, reduce supply, and limit consumer access. He frames it as an equity issue. Strict standards would make honey more expensive, pricing out low-income families. Better to have affordable honey that's been processed than expensive honey that's out of reach. It's a clever argument that reframes the issue from quality to access, from authenticity to affordability. You watch the FDA officials listening, calculating political ramifications. The honey industry is worth over $600 million annually. The big food companies have lobbying power. The beekeepers have passion, but no political organization. The decision is already made, really. The meeting is just theatre, a regulatory requirement to show that stakeholders were consulted. But the outcome was determined before anyone entered this beige room. Can you feel the moment when public interest loses to corporate interest? A food scientist presents technical arguments about honey chemistry.
You're in a monastery in Greece, on Mount Athos, watching Orthodox monks tend their bees exactly as their predecessors did 1,000 years ago. The monastery is built into a cliff face overlooking the Aegean Sea, and the bees forage on wild thyme, oregano, and pine trees that cling to the rocky slopes. The honey they produce is dark, resinous, intensely medicinal. It tastes like the mountain itself. The monks move between the hives in silence, their black robes absorbing the Mediterranean sun. They don't use smoke or protective gear, just slow, deliberate movements that keep the bees calm. One monk, Father Christophoros, lifts a frame from a hive and examines it closely. The comb is dark brown, almost black in places, heavy with honey that's been left to ripen for months. He nods in satisfaction, and returns the frame gently. The air smells like pine resin and wild herbs. That particular scent of Greek mountainsides that tourists try to capture in bottles but never can. The bees are loud here, thousands of them working the sparse flowers that bloom between rocks. This isn't a rich landscape for beekeeping. The nectar flow is limited, but the honey these bees produce is some of the most potent in the world, concentrated with compounds from pine sap and mountain herbs. But I haven't told you why these monks will never change their methods, no matter what modern beekeeping offers. Father Christophoros carries a small section of comb back to the monastery kitchen, and you follow him through stone corridors that have stood for 800 years. The kitchen is simple: a wood-fired oven, a stone sink, wooden shelves holding clay jars. He cuts the comb into a bowl and crushes it gently with his hands, separating honey from wax. The honey flows slowly, thick as molasses, darker than coffee. He doesn't strain it through anything finer than loose cloth. The pollen, the propolis, the tiny bits of wax, everything stays in. He fills a small jar and sets it aside for a visiting pilgrim who has a chronic cough. The monks give their honey away freely to those who need it for healing. They sell some at the monastery shop, but only to fund their basic needs. They're not trying to compete in the honey market. They're not trying to build a business. They're making medicine the way their order has made it for a millennium. And the fact that the outside world has forgotten how to do this is irrelevant to them. You watch Father Christophoros clean the bowl with a damp cloth, his movements practiced and meditative. Everything here is done with deliberation, with attention, with prayer. The bees are not livestock to be exploited. They're fellow creatures doing God's work, transforming flowers into sustenance. Taking their honey is a privilege, not a right, and it must be done with gratitude and restraint. Can you imagine living in a world where honey is sacred again, where its production is prayer? Later you sit in the monastery's small chapel while the monks chant Vespers. The evening light slants through narrow windows, illuminating icons painted with egg tempera and honey. Yes, honey. The same honey the bees make is used as a binder in the sacred art, mixed with pigments to create colours that will last centuries. The monks understand that honey preserves, that it protects, that it connects the temporary to the eternal. After prayers, Father Christophoros invites you to share a simple meal: bread, olives, tomatoes, and honey. He spreads the dark honey on bread and offers it to you. When you taste it, you understand immediately why this honey is different. It's not sweet in the way commercial honey is sweet. It's complex, almost savoury, with notes of pine and herbs, and something faintly bitter that makes you want more. It's medicine that tastes like food, food that works like medicine. He explains, in halting English, that this honey has been tested by universities. The antioxidant levels are extraordinarily high. The antimicrobial activity rivals medical-grade Manuka honey. The mineral content reflects the mountain's geology. This honey is a concentrated expression of this specific place, these specific plants, this specific ecosystem. You couldn't make it anywhere else, and you couldn't fake it in a laboratory. The monastery's honey production is tiny, maybe 300 pounds per year. Compare that to industrial operations producing millions of pounds. But the monks aren't concerned with scale. They're concerned with quality, with tradition, with doing things rightly. If the world wants to process honey into oblivion, that's the world's problem. Here on this mountain, honey remains what it has always been. You leave Mount Athos the next morning, carrying a small jar of the monk's honey as a gift. On the ferry back to the mainland, you open it and smell it one more time. Pine and thyme and something indefinable. You know this jar will last you months, because you'll use it sparingly, medicinally, the way people used honey before industrial food systems taught them to think of it as just another sweetener. By the time the ferry reaches port, you're already wondering if you'll ever find honey like this again, or if this was a glimpse of something nearly extinct. You're in a research facility in Amsterdam, 2020, watching scientists extract DNA from honey samples to verify their floral and geographic origins. The technology is cutting edge, using genetic sequencing to identify every plant the bees visited, every pollen grain in the honey, creating a molecular fingerprint that's nearly impossible to fake. This is forensic botany applied to food fraud, and it's revealing just how widespread the deception is. The lab smells like chemicals and ozone from the sequencing machines. A researcher named Dr. Eva Jansson is loading samples into a device that costs more than most cars. Each sample will be analysed for plant DNA, insect DNA, geographic markers, even atmospheric pollutants that can pinpoint where bees foraged. The technology can tell whether Italian honey actually came from Italy or was packaged there after being imported from China. She shows you results from a blind study of commercial honey, 50 samples purchased from stores across Europe, analysed for authenticity. The results are damning. 37 samples contain DNA from plants that don't grow in the regions listed on their labels. 15 samples contain corn syrup DNA, proving adulteration. 22 samples contain pollen from flowers in regions known for contaminated honey production. Only 13 samples, barely a quarter, are what they claim to be. But I haven't told you what happens to this research and why it doesn't change anything. Dr. Jansson publishes her findings in a peer-reviewed journal. The study makes news briefly, generates some social media outrage, then disappears beneath the constant flow of information. The honey companies issue statements saying they're committed to quality and taking these findings seriously. Nothing changes. The fake honey keeps flowing. The fraud continues because exposing the problem and solving the problem are entirely different things. The issue is economic. Testing honey using DNA sequencing costs approximately $500 per sample. Multiply that by millions of jars, and the testing costs more than the honey itself. Regulatory agencies don't have the budget for comprehensive testing. They rely on spot checks and random sampling, which catch perhaps 1% of fraudulent products. The honey industry knows this and factors it into their risk calculations. The profit from fraud far exceeds the occasional fine. Dr. Jansson shows you a map of global honey flows, arrows representing millions of pounds of honey, moving from China to Thailand to Germany to the United States, getting laundered through multiple countries to obscure its origin. It's a shell game played with shipping containers, where Chinese honey becomes Thai honey, becomes German honey, becomes American honey, all while remaining the same adulterated product. The paper trail is deliberately complex, designed to frustrate investigators. Can you imagine a food system so corrupt that origin itself becomes meaningless? She pulls up another study, this one tracking heavy metals in commercial honey. Lead, cadmium, mercury, all present in concerning concentrations in honey from certain regions. These contaminants come from industrial pollution, from bees foraging near factories and highways, and mining operations. The honey gets mixed into the global supply, diluting the contamination just enough to pass safety tests, but not eliminating it. Consumers eating this honey are getting chronic, low-level exposure to toxins and pesticides. The study shows glyphosate residues in 75% of honey samples tested, neonicotinoids in 45%, fungicides in 60%. These chemicals are supposed to be used carefully, away from bees, but in reality they're everywhere. Bees forage across thousands of acres, and if any of those acres have been treated with pesticides, the residues end up in honey. The concentrations are below regulatory limits, but those limits were set for individual exposure, not cumulative exposure to dozens of chemicals simultaneously. Dr. Jansson sits back and removes her glasses, rubbing her eyes. She's been studying honey fraud for 5 years now, and the scope of the problem just keeps expanding. Every time she thinks she understands how bad it is, she discovers a new layer of deception. Fake honey, contaminated honey, mislabeled honey, adulterated honey. The global honey supply is so compromised that she's not sure there's any way to fix it without completely dismantling and rebuilding the entire supply chain. She shows you one final image, electron microscope photos of pollen grains from a sample labeled pure clover honey. The pollen includes clover, yes, but also rice, corn, and several species that grow exclusively in Southeast Asia. This honey is a Frankenstein blend of multiple sources, heat processed to meld them together, ultra-filtered to remove evidence, then relabeled as a single origin product. It's food fraud as an art form. The lab is getting dark now. Researchers are shutting down equipment, preparing to go home. Dr. Janssen saves her data and closes her laptop. Tomorrow she'll analyze more samples, document more fraud, add more evidence to a growing archive that few people outside academic circles will ever see. The research will sit in journals behind paywalls, inaccessible to the consumers who need it most. By the time you leave the building, the Amsterdam streets are wet with rain, reflecting streetlights in broken patterns. You're in a small town in Oregon, 1954, watching a family-owned honey company bottle their harvest. 3 generations are working together, grandmother labeling jars by hand, father operating the hand-cranked extractor, teenage son carrying frames of capped honey from the storeroom. This is how most American honey was produced 70 years ago. Small operations, local distribution, direct connection between beekeeper and consumer. The bottling room smells overwhelmingly of honey, that thick floral sweetness mixed with beeswax and wood. Sunlight streams through windows, catching dust motes and making the honey glow in its glass jars. The grandmother's handwriting on each label is slightly different, personal, human. She writes the date, the floral saucer blackberry, June 1954, and her initials. If someone has a problem with this honey, they know exactly who to talk to. The father is explaining to his son how to tell when honey is properly ripened. You shake a capped frame, he says, and if you hear sloshing, it's not ready. The bees haven't reduced the moisture enough. Leave it in the hive another week. But if the frame is heavy and silent, it's perfect. The boy nods, learning the knowledge his father learned from his grandfather, who learned it from his grandfather, an unbroken chain of practical wisdom stretching back generations. But I haven't told you what will happen to this family business in 20 years. The extraction process is simple, almost primitive. They uncap the cells with a hot knife, place the frames in a hand-cranked extractor, and spin out the honey through centrifugal force. It comes out thick and full of tiny wax particles. They pour it through a coarse strainer that catches the big chunks but leaves everything else: pollen, propolis, bee parts occasionally. This honey looks cloudy, imperfect, real. Customers expect it to look this way. They'd be suspicious if it was perfectly clear. The grandmother tells a story while she works. During the Depression, their honey saved the family. When money was worthless and banks were failing, they traded honey for flour, eggs, vegetables, medical care. A pound of honey could buy a week's worth of groceries. The doctor accepted honey as payment for delivering babies. The dentist took honey for filling cavities. Everyone recognized its value because everyone understood what it was. You watch them fill 48 jars, their entire week's production. Each jar holds 1 pound of honey that represents hundreds of hours of bee labor, thousands of flower visits, the concentrated essence of their small farm's summer bloom. They'll sell these jars at the local market for $1.25 each, which is expensive but fair. The people who buy this honey know the family, know the bees, know the blackberry thickets where the nectar came from. Can you imagine knowing exactly where your food comes from and who made it? The teenage son asks his father if they'll ever expand, get more hives, sell to grocery stores. The father shakes his head. More hives would mean less attention per hive, lower quality honey. Selling to stores would mean meeting their requirements, ultra-filtering, pasteurization, uniform color and consistency. They'd have to change everything about how they work to meet industrial standards. And for what? So strangers in distant cities could buy their honey for less than it costs to produce? No, the father says. We'll stay small. We'll keep doing it right. There's enough customers locally who appreciate quality. We don't need to be rich. We just need to make good honey and live well. The son accepts this, though you can see in his eyes that he doesn't quite understand yet. He's 17, and the post-war economic boom is everywhere. Everyone's talking about scaling up, modernizing, maximizing efficiency. His father's attachment to old methods seems quaint, almost backward. Fast forward to 1974. The father has passed away. The grandmother is too old to work. The son, now middle-aged, has inherited the business, and he's struggling. Cheap imported honey is flooding the market. The grocery stores that used to carry local honey have switched to cheaper alternatives. His production costs have tripled, but he can't raise prices because customers can buy honey for a fraction of what he charges. He's working twice as hard and earning half as much. By 1978, he'll sell the equipment and the hives to a larger operation that will modernize everything. The handwritten labels will disappear. The blackberry honey will be blended with clover honey from 3 states away, heated and filtered until it's unrecognizable. The connection between place and product will be severed. Another family business will become just another data point in the consolidation of American food production. But here, in 1954, none of that has happened yet. The grandmother is still writing labels, the father is still teaching his son, the honey is still real. Outside the bottling room, bees are working the blackberries that grow wild along the fence line, making tomorrow's harvest, continuing the ancient work. By sunset, all 48 jars are labeled and ready for market. You're inside a human gut now, microscopic again, watching what happens when someone consumes real honey versus processed honey over time. 2 different people, 2 different diets, 2 different outcomes. The first person has been eating raw, local honey for 6 months. The second has been eating ultra-filtered commercial honey for the same period. The differences in their microbiomes are striking. In the first person's gut, diversity is thriving. Beneficial bacteria, Lactobacillus, Bifidobacterium, Akkermansia, are flourishing, fed by the oligosaccharides and prebiotics in raw honey. These bacteria are producing short-chain fatty acids that reduce inflammation throughout the body. They're synthesizing vitamins that the person never consumed directly. They're communicating with the immune system, training it to respond appropriately to threats, without overreacting to harmless stimuli. The gut lining itself looks healthier, more intact. The tight junctions between intestinal cells are properly sealed, preventing undigested food particles and bacteria from leaking into the bloodstream. This person has been avoiding leaky gut syndrome without even knowing they were at risk. The anti-inflammatory compounds in raw honey, flavonoids, phenylolic acids, B-peptides, have been quietly protecting their intestinal barrier for months. But I haven't told you what the second person's gut looks like after 6 months of processed honey. In the second person's microbiome, you see dominance of opportunistic bacteria that thrive on simple sugars. Firmicutes are overrepresented compared to Bacteroidetes, a ratio associated with obesity and metabolic dysfunction. Beneficial bacteria have declined because they're not getting the complex carbohydrates and prebiotic compounds they need. The gut has essentially become a monoculture, lacking the diversity that confers resilience and health. The gut lining shows early signs of damage. Some tight junctions are loosening, allowing bacterial endotoxins to enter the bloodstream. This triggers chronic low-grade inflammation throughout the body. The person's immune system is constantly activated at a low level, producing inflammatory cytokines that contribute to insulin resistance, cardiovascular disease, and neuroinflammation. They don't feel acutely sick, they just feel tired, foggy, slightly off in ways they can't quite articulate. Their blood sugar regulation is also deteriorating. The pancreatic beta cells are working overtime to produce insulin, and over time they're becoming exhausted. The person is on a trajectory toward insulin resistance and potentially type 2 diabetes, though they're years away from diagnosis. If they continue eating processed honey thinking it's a healthy sweetener, they're accelerating toward metabolic disease. Can you see how 2 substances called honey can have completely opposite effects on human health? You zoom out to the nervous system, following the gut-brain axis. In the first person, signals from the healthy gut microbiome are reaching the brain through the vagus nerve. These signals influence neurotransmitter production, mood regulation, stress response. This person has been experiencing better sleep, more stable mood, improved focus. They attribute these improvements to various factors: better work-life balance, yoga, meditation, never realizing that their gut bacteria, fed by real honey, are contributing significantly. In the second person, the gut-brain signals are different. The inflammatory compounds leaking from their damaged gut are reaching the brain, contributing to anxiety, brain fog, and poor sleep quality. They've been trying various supplements and medications to address these symptoms, never connecting them to the healthy honey they eat every morning. The processed honey is part of the problem, not part of the solution. Over time, these differences will compound. The first person will maintain metabolic health, strong immunity, and cognitive function well into old age. The second person will likely develop one or more chronic diseases, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, autoimmune conditions, in middle age. Both will believe their health outcomes are primarily due to genetics, stress levels, or luck. Neither will trace it back to the honey. You're watching cellular aging now, telomeres at the ends of chromosomes. In the first person, the antioxidants from raw honey are protecting against oxidative stress, slowing telomere shortening. Their biological age is younger than their chronological age. In the second person, oxidative damage is accelerating aging. Their biological age is older than their chronological age. The difference is measurable, though neither person will ever have their telomeres tested. This is the invisible consequence of food fraud, not immediate harm that triggers lawsuits and recalls, but slow, cumulative degradation of health that's impossible to trace to a single cause. Multiply this by millions of people eating processed honey daily, and you have a significant public health problem that's completely hidden within the normal variation of human health outcomes. By the time you return to normal scale, both people are continuing their daily routines, unaware of the cellular differences unfolding inside them. You're in New Zealand again, 2023, visiting a Manuka honey producer who's trying to fight back against fraud. Her name is Aroha, and she's Maori, and her family has been working with bees on this land for 4 generations. She's standing in her processing facility, which is spotlessly clean but deliberately low-tech. No heat exchangers, no ultrafiltration systems, just gravity strainers and patience. The facility smells like Manuka flowers, that medicinal, slightly antiseptic scent that's distinctive to this specific honey. Aroha is showing you her traceability system. Every jar has a QR code that links to photographs of the specific hive, GPS coordinates of where it sat during harvest, laboratory test results, showing methyl glyoxal levels, and a video of Aroha herself explaining this particular batch. Its transparency is a competitive advantage. She tells you the fraud problem with Manuka honey is even worse than regular honey. Approximately 10,000 tons of Manuka honey are produced globally each year, but around 100,000 tons are sold. The math doesn't work. For every jar of real Manuka honey, there are 9 jars of fake Manuka honey flooding the market. Some of it is regular honey, with added chemicals to mimic the methyl glyoxal signature. Some is just labeled Manuka, with no connection to the actual plant. But I haven't told you what Aroha's fighting against, and why she's probably going to lose. Her honey sells for $80 per jar. It's expensive because it's real, tested, certified, traceable. But on Amazon, you can buy Manuka honey for $15 per jar, shipped from who knows where, with fake lab reports and fabricated UMF ratings. Consumers see both products, don't understand the difference, and buy the cheap one. They think they're getting a bargain. They're actually getting regular honey, with maybe a hint of Manuka, if they're lucky. Aroha has hired lawyers. She's reported fraudulent sellers to platforms. She's contacted consumer protection agencies in multiple countries. The response is always the same: not enough resources, not high enough priority, difficult to prosecute across international borders. The fraud continues because it's profitable, and the enforcement is nearly non-existent. Meanwhile, legitimate producers like Aroha are going deeper into debt, competing against counterfeit versions of their own product. She shows you her bees, working the Manuka scrubland behind her facility. Manuka is a tough plant, low and scrubby, that grows in poor soil other plants can't handle. The flowers are small, white, unremarkable. But the bees know. They visit these flowers with the same dedication they'd give to lush garden blooms, and they make honey that has genuine medicinal properties, honey that hospitals actually use for wound care. Can you imagine producing real medicine and watching fake versions undermine everything you've built? Aroha's daughter is with her today, a young woman in her 20s who's studying business at university. The daughter asks the question that's been hanging in the air: should they just sell out to one of the big honey corporations? Accept a buyout, take the money, let someone else fight these battles? Aroha is quiet for a long time. Then she says no. This land is taonga, a treasure. The bees are taonga. The knowledge of how to work with them properly is taonga. Some things aren't for sale, even when keeping them means financial hardship. But you can see the strain in her face. The business is barely breaking even. The fraud is getting worse, not better. The big corporations can afford to fight legal battles and fund lobbying efforts. Small producers like Aroha are just trying to survive. The market is systematically rewarding the fraudsters and punishing the honest producers, and there's no clear path to changing that dynamic. You watch a tour group arrive, people who've paid extra to visit the source of their honey, to see the manuka bushes and meet the beekeeper. Aroha transforms, becoming animated and welcoming, explaining how manuka honey is made and why it's special. The tourists taste fresh honey straight from the extractor, and their faces light up. This is what it's supposed to taste like, they say, so different from what we bought online. Aroha nods patiently. She's had this conversation hundreds.
You're in a biochemistry textbook illustration, inside a honeycomb cell, watching the molecular transformation that turns nectar into honey. The process is more complex than you imagined. A house bee has just deposited partially processed nectar, and now the real chemistry begins. Enzymes are breaking chemical bonds, reforming them, creating new compounds that didn't exist in the original flowers. Invertufts is cleaving sucrose molecules into glucose and fructose. You can see the molecular structures changing, the disaccharide becoming monosaccharides. This isn't just breaking down sugar, it's transforming it into a form that's simultaneously more stable and more bioavailable. The glucose and fructose will crystallize at different rates, giving honey its unique texture. They'll be absorbed at different speeds in the human gut, preventing the blood sugar spike that sucrose causes. Glucose oxidase is slowly producing hydrogen peroxide as a byproduct of converting glucose. The hydrogen peroxide levels are carefully controlled, enough to sterilize the honey, not enough to damage the honey itself. This is molecular level precision that no human chemist could achieve with such elegance. The hydrogen peroxide will gradually break down over time, but while fresh, it makes the honey actively antimicrobial, chansons. But I haven't told you about the thousands of other compounds being created simultaneously. The bees are adding proteins from their hypopharyngeal glands, defensin-1, rhallicin, and dozens of others with antimicrobial properties. These aren't preservatives added to prevent spoilage. They're defensive compounds the bees make to protect their food supply from the bacteria and fungi that would love to colonize this sugar-rich environment. The hive is essentially a warm, humid incubator, perfect conditions for microbial growth. Yet honey never spoils because of this molecular armament. The pollen grains floating in the honey are breaking down slightly, releasing proteins, lipids, vitamins, and minerals. Flavonoids from flower petals are being incorporated into the honey's chemical matrix. Phenolic acids from tree resins that bees collected as propolis are mixing with the nectar-derived compounds, creating synergistic effects where the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. This is why synthetic honey is impossible to create. You can't just mix glucose, fructose, and water and call it honey. You're missing the thousands of trace compounds that make real honey medicinal. Can you see the difference between food that's made and food that's manufactured? You zoom into the pollen grains themselves.
Each one is a time capsule containing the DNA of the plant that produced it, proteins specific to that plant species, lipids that give honey its distinctive flavour, and minerals absorbed from the soil where that plant grew. A single spoonful of honey might contain pollen from 50 different plant species, creating a chemical fingerprint of an entire ecosystem. This is why local honey might help with allergies, not because of homeopathic principles, but because it contains tiny amounts of the exact proteins your immune system is overreacting to, potentially helping it calibrate its response. The water content is dropping now as house bees fan their wings, creating airflow that evaporates excess moisture. The concentration is critical. Above 18% water content, yeast can survive and ferment the honey. Below 18%, nothing can grow. The bees measure this with astonishing precision, not through instruments but through instinct refined over millions of years of evolution. When the moisture hits the sweet spot, they cap the cell with wax, sealing in perfection. You watch one last transformation, the Maillard reaction, where amino acids and sugars interact to create hundreds of new flavour compounds. This is the same reaction that makes bread crust brown and coffee taste complex. In honey, it happens slowly, over weeks, creating depth and complexity that fresh nectar lacks. This is why aged honey tastes different from fresh honey, why connoisseurs can identify not just the flowers but the season and weather conditions when the nectar was gathered. Now contrast this with industrial honey processing. The honey is heated to 160 degrees, which stops all enzymatic activity instantly. The invertase denatures, the glucose oxidase stops working, the antimicrobial proteins unfold and lose their function. The delicate flavour compounds break down or volatilize. The honey is then forced through filters so fine they remove every particle larger than a micron, all the pollen, all the propolis, most of the proteins. What remains is essentially just glucose, fructose and water. It's still sweet, but it's no longer honey in any meaningful sense. The processed honey is then sometimes blended with corn syrup, which has a similar sugar profile, but none of honey's complexity. Or it's adulterated with rice syrup, which is harder to detect. The result passes simple tests for honey. It's sweet, it has the right sugar ratios, but it lacks everything that makes honey valuable. It's a molecular ghost, the shape of honey without its substance. By the time you zoom back out to human scale, you understand calling ultra-processed honey honey is like calling a photograph of a forest nature. You're in a kindergarten classroom in suburban Atlanta 2025, watching a teacher give her students honey sticks as a treat. Little plastic tubes filled with honey, handed out after story time. The children suck on them happily, getting that sugar rush, their energy levels spiking. The teacher thinks she's giving them something healthier than candy. She's read articles about honey being natural and wholesome. She has no idea she's giving them corn syrup with honey flavouring. The classroom smells like crayons and hand sanitizer, and now, faintly, of artificial honey flavour. 23 children aged 5 and 6, all consuming what the package labels as pure honey sticks. The ingredients list is technically accurate honey, but the honey inside has been so processed, so adulterated, so stripped of everything valuable, that it's functionally identical to high fructose corn syrup. The children's blood sugar is spiking right now. Their pancreas is working overtime to produce insulin. You watch one child, a boy named Marcus, who's already showing signs of insulin resistance at age 6. His pediatrician has warned his mother about his weight, his blood sugar levels, his risk for early onset diabetes. His mother switched him from regular candy to healthier alternatives like honey sticks, fruit snacks made with real fruit juice, and granola bars. She doesn't realize that all of these supposedly healthy options have the same metabolic impact as candy. The marketing has fooled her completely. But I haven't told you how this single classroom represents a public health crisis playing out across millions of schools. The teacher finishes the story and moves to the next activity, unaware that half her students are now experiencing a sugar crash. Some become hyperactive, unable to sit still. Others become irritable and unfocused. The classroom management problems she's experiencing aren't behavioral issues or attention disorders. They're metabolic consequences of feeding children processed sugar disguised as healthy food. But she doesn't make the connection. Nobody does. The school district has a contract with a snack supplier that provides these honey sticks at bulk discount. The supplier's marketing materials emphasize that honey is natural, traditional, and healthier than artificial sweeteners. They don't mention that their honey is imported, ultra-filtered, potentially adulterated, and nutritionally indistinguishable from corn syrup. The district's purchasing decisions are based on cost and marketing claims, not nutritional analysis. They're trying to feed children well on an inadequate budget, and they're being systematically deceived. You follow Marcus through the rest of his school day. By lunch, his blood sugar has crashed, and he's ravenously hungry. He eats quickly, consuming more calories than his body needs, because his satiety signals are disrupted by the earlier sugar spike. After lunch, he's tired, struggling to focus during reading time. His teacher notes this as a potential learning disability, and suggests to his mother that he might need evaluation for ADHD. Can you see how food fraud creates cascading health problems that get misdiagnosed as individual pathology? By the end of the school year, Marcus will have consumed approximately 180 of these honey sticks, plus countless other processed foods marketed as healthy. His insulin resistance will worsen, his weight will continue climbing, his risk factors for diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and metabolic syndrome will all increase, and everyone, his mother, his teacher, his pediatrician, will focus on individual solutions, more exercise, better portion control, possible medication. Nobody will trace the problem back to systematic food fraud in the supply chain. Multiply Marcus by millions of children across the country, all consuming processed honey and other adulterated foods marketed as healthy. You're looking at a generation being metabolically damaged by products their parents trust, the honey industry, the food manufacturers, the marketing companies. They're all profiting from this deception, and the children are paying the price with their health. The school day ends. The children file out to waiting parents and buses. The teacher stays late, cleaning the classroom, finding sticky honey stick wrappers under desks. She tosses them in the recycling bin, thinking she's doing something good by choosing honey over candy. Tomorrow she'll hand out more honey sticks, continuing the cycle, never knowing she's part of a system that's slowly poisoning the children she cares about. You watch Marcus get into his mother's car. She asks about his day, and he says he's hungry. She planned to make a healthy dinner: grilled chicken, vegetables, brown rice. But he begs for something else, something sweeter. His palate has been hijacked by processed sugars, his brain constantly seeking the next hit. She compromises, adding honey to the vegetables to make them more appealing. The same processed honey that caused the problem in the first place. By bedtime, Marcus has consumed the equivalent of 15 teaspoons of added sugar today, mostly from products marketed as healthy: honey sticks, yogurt with honey, cereal with honey, honey-sweetened granola bars. His mother thinks she's making good choices. The food industry has made it nearly impossible for her to know the truth. The night settles over suburban Atlanta, and in millions of homes, similar scenes play out: children consuming fake food, labeled as real, parents deceived by marketing, health consequences accumulating invisibly in small bodies. You're in a cemetery in rural Vermont, standing at a grave marked 1847. The headstone is simple: Thomas Whitmore, beekeeper, beloved father. Beside it are 3 smaller stones, his children, all died in infancy. This was common then. Infant mortality was devastating, infections routinely fatal, medicine primitive by modern standards. But you notice something. Thomas lived to 73, ancient by 19th century standards. And you know why. The cemetery is quiet, except for wind moving through old maples that shade the graves. Moss grows on the older stones, making some inscriptions difficult to read. You find other beekeepers buried here. It's marked on their stones as a point of pride, the way modern headstones might say doctor or teacher. Beekeepers were respected because they produced medicine, not just food, and they consumed that medicine daily, protecting themselves against infections that killed their neighbours. You learn that Thomas kept 30 hives, sold honey and beeswax to the community, and lived alone after his wife and children died of scarlet fever, a disease that honey couldn't cure, that nothing could cure before antibiotics. But the chronic infections, the small wounds that went septic, the digestive problems, the seasonal illnesses, honey helped with all of those. Thomas lived decades longer than average because he ate real honey daily, and used it to treat every minor ailment before it became major. But I haven't told you what the average lifespan would be if modern people had access to real honey the way Thomas did. You find yourself in a research institute's computer model, watching simulations run. They're calculating the population-level health impact if ultra-processed foods were replaced with real, traditional versions. The model accounts for metabolic disease rates, inflammation markers, gut health, immune function. When they replace processed honey with raw honey in the diet simulation, the results are striking 12% reduction in diabetes rates, 8% reduction in cardiovascular disease, 6% improvement in immune function, 4% decrease in inflammatory diseases. These aren't dramatic miracle cures, they're marginal improvements across millions of people. But marginal improvements in population health translate to millions of lives extended, billions in healthcare costs saved, immeasurable reduction in suffering. The researchers running this simulation will publish their findings in an obscure journal. Policymakers won't read it. Food industry lobbyists will ignore it. The information will exist, but change nothing. You're back in the present now, walking through a modern supermarket at night when it's mostly empty. The honey aisle glows under fluorescent lights, dozens of bottles and jars all claiming to be honey. You pick them up one by one, reading labels, knowing what you now know: pure, natural, raw, organic. Most of these claims are technically legal, but functionally meaningless. The honey inside these containers has been processed until it barely qualifies as food, let alone medicine. Can you feel the weight of what's been lost, not just for individuals, but for civilization? Honey was one of humanity's original medicines, used continuously for at least 8,000 years. Every major civilization, Egyptian, Greek, Roman, Chinese, Indian, Islamic, European, documented honey's healing properties. For millennia, this knowledge was preserved, refined, passed down through generations. And then in less than a century, it was almost completely destroyed by industrial food processing and corporate profit motives. The knowledge still exists in fragments, in research laboratories, in traditional medicine practices, in monasteries, in small apiaries run by keepers like Tom in Vermont and Aroha in New Zealand. But it's been pushed to the margins, dismissed as folk wisdom, economically unviable in modern markets. The average person has no idea that honey used to be medicine. They think it's just another sweetener, maybe slightly better than sugar, worth buying if it's cheap and convenient. You stand in the supermarket holding a jar labelled raw unfiltered honey that costs $12.99. You read the fine print, product of Mexico, Brazil, and India, packed in the USA. This isn't local, this isn't traceable. This might not even be raw despite the label, but it's the best option available in this store, so you buy it anyway, knowing it's probably still better than the $3.99 plastic bear. On your way out, you pass a pharmacy section filled with antibiotics, antihistamines, acid reducers, anti-inflammatories, immune boosters, probiotic supplements. Hundreds of products designed to treat conditions that real honey helps prevent or manage. The irony is staggering. We've created a medical industrial complex to treat diseases partly caused by processed food, while the traditional medicine that could help sits on shelves, so adulterated it's become part of the problem. The supermarket doors slide open, and you step into the night air. Somewhere, bees are sleeping in their hives, clustered for warmth, waiting for morning when they'll resume the ancient work of turning flowers into medicine. They're still doing it right. They haven't changed. We have. By dawn, millions more jars of fake honey will be sold, and the gap between what honey is and what people think it is will widen further. You're in a small laboratory in rural Japan, 2022, watching an elderly researcher named Dr. Takeshi Yamamoto examine honey samples under equipment that looks decades old. He's been studying honey for 53 years, since before Japan's honey industry was modernized, when every region produced distinctive honey that reflected its landscape. He's created an archive of honey samples dating back to 1969, and he's comparing them to modern samples from the same locations. The laboratory smells like old paper and machine oil, and faintly of honey from decades past. Dr. Yamamoto's hands shake slightly as he places a 1972 sample under the microscope. Honey that's somehow still preserved, still analyzable. The pollen profile is extraordinary. 17 different plant species, all native to the mountain region where it was collected. The sample is dark, crystallized, but when he dissolves a tiny amount in water, you can still smell the complexity. He switches to a 2022 sample from the exact same region, purchased from a local producer who claims to follow traditional methods. Under the microscope, the difference is heartbreaking. Only 4 plant species represented. The pollen count is much lower overall, suggesting ultrafiltration. The color is lighter, more uniform. When dissolved, it smells sweet but flat, missing those layers of floral and herbal notes. Even the traditional producers have succumbed to modern processing standards because consumers expect honey to look a certain way. But I haven't told you what Dr. Yamamoto discovered that made him devote his entire life to this research. In 1971, his daughter became seriously ill with an infection that wasn't responding to antibiotics. She was 6 years old, and the doctors were running out of options. Dr. Yamamoto's mother, a traditional healer in their village, suggested applying honey to the infected surgical site. The doctors were skeptical but desperate. They allowed it. Within 3 days, the infection began clearing. Within a week, his daughter was recovering. The doctors called it luck. Dr. Yamamoto called it a mystery worth investigating. He spent 5 decades trying to understand what's in honey that modern medicine can't replicate. He's published over 200 papers, most in Japanese journals that Western researchers never read. He's isolated compounds, tested them individually and in combination, tried to synthesize them artificially. Nothing works as well as the whole, unprocessed honey. The synergy between thousands of compounds creates effects that no single ingredient can match. His archive contains 1,847 honey samples from across Japan, each one documented with collection date, location, floral source, and detailed chemical analysis. He's watching Japanese honey diversity decline year by year. Monoculture agriculture has reduced the variety of flowers bees can visit. Pesticides have contaminated even remote mountain regions. Climate change has shifted blooming patterns, disrupting the timing that bees and flowers evolved together over millennia. Can you imagine spending your entire career documenting the slow death of something ancient and irreplaceable? Dr. Yamamoto shows you his most treasured sample, honey collected in 1969 from a now extinct flowering tree species. The tree grew only in one valley, bloomed for 3 weeks each spring, and was cut down in 1974 to make room for a resort. This honey is the only remaining record of what that tree's nectar tasted like, what compounds it produced, what medicinal properties it might have had. He'll never be able to study it thoroughly because there's too little left. It's a footnote in botanical history, a ghost in a glass vial. He tells you that modern honey, even when genuinely raw and local, is fundamentally different from honey produced 50 years ago. The environment has changed, the flowers have changed, the bees have changed, selectively bred for docility and productivity rather than the wild genetics that gave them resilience. Even if processing practices returned to traditional methods, the honey itself wouldn't be the same, because the world isn't the same. You watch him label a new sample, Tokyo 2022, Urban Rooftop Apiaries. Tokyo beekeepers are trying to revive urban honey production, placing hives on building rooftops where bees forage in parks and gardens. It's a creative solution to habitat loss, but the honey reflects urban pollution. Trace amounts of heavy metals, microplastics, volatile organic compounds from traffic. It's still honey, still better than processed alternatives, but it's a honey that Brother Thomas would find alien, contaminated by substances that didn't exist in 1347. Dr. Yamamoto closes his archive notebook and sits back, looking tired in a way that goes beyond physical exhaustion. He's tired of documenting loss, tired of fighting battles that can't be won, tired of knowing things that nobody in power wants to hear. His daughter, now in her 50s, healthy and successful, sometimes asks why he's still doing this research. What's the point when nothing changes? He says it's for the archive, for whoever comes after, for the possibility that someday humanity might want to know what was lost and how to recover it. The archive is an act of hope, disguised as scientific documentation. It's preservation in the face of inevitable decay. its memory refusing to surrender to forgetting. By the time you leave his laboratory, the sun has set over Tokyo, and Dr. Yamamoto is still at his microscope, examining samples, adding notes to his archive, continuing work that will probably die with him. You're standing in a meadow that doesn't exist yet, 50 years in the future, watching bees work flowers that humanity almost lost. This is a restoration project, a small victory in the larger story of environmental recovery. Someone remembered what these flowers were, what this meadow looked like before industrial agriculture, what honey tasted like when bees had access to this diversity. And they brought it back, painstakingly, plant by plant, year by year. The meadow smells the way meadows used to smell before pesticides and monoculture complex, layered, alive. Wildflowers in dozens of species bloom in overlapping waves from early spring through late fall. The bees here are descendants of wild colonies that survived, that maintain genetic diversity, that remember how to forage across varied landscapes. Their honey is darker, more medicinal, more complex than anything commercially available in 2025. A small cooperative of beekeepers maintains this meadow and others like it. They harvest honey using methods Brother Thomas would recognize. Minimal processing, no heating, no filtering, beyond coarse straining. They sell it locally for prices that reflect its true value. Their customers understand what they're buying because the keepers educate them, show them the meadows, explain the process, build relationships. It's honey as it was meant to be, connection between place, plant, bee, and human. But I haven't told you how we got from where we are now to this future meadow. It wasn't policy changes or regulatory reforms. Those never came. The FDA never established meaningful honey standards. The fraud continued, the processing continued, the fake honey kept flowing. But something else happened. Enough individuals made different choices. They sought out real honey, paid premium prices, supported local beekeepers, rejected cheap alternatives. They created demand for quality that couldn't be ignored. Small beekeepers survived and slowly expanded. They shared knowledge, formed cooperatives, built direct-to-consumer networks that bypassed conventional retail. They used technology not for ultrafiltration but for traceability and education. QR codes on jars led to videos of specific hives, maps of foraging areas, test results showing pollen content and antimicrobial activity. Transparency became their competitive advantage. Medical research eventually caught up, publishing large-scale studies that confirmed what traditional medicine always knew. Real honey prevents and treats numerous conditions. Hospitals began using medical-grade honey again, not as a last resort, but as first-line treatment for wounds and infections. Insurance companies, seeing the cost savings, began covering honey therapy. Doctors started prescribing it, not as alternative medicine, but as evidence-based treatment. Can you imagine a future where food is medicine again, where the two aren't separate categories? Education changed too. Schools began teaching children where food comes from, how it's processed, what to look for. A generation grew up understanding that clear, cheap honey is probably fake, that crystallization is normal, that local and seasonal matter. They rejected their parents' processed foods not out of rebellion but out of knowledge. They wanted food that was real, and they were willing to pay for it, and wait for it, and work for it. The meadow you're standing in is the result of these incremental changes compounded over decades. It started with one person, then 10, then hundreds, then thousands, all making slightly different choices that added up to systemic change. The industrial honey complex still exists in this future, still churning out processed products, but it's shrinking, losing market share to an alternative system built on transparency, quality, and connection. You watch a young beekeeper, maybe 25 years old, check his hives in this meadow. He's using techniques passed down from mentors who remembered the old ways, combined with modern understanding of bee health and ecology. He's part of a network of young farmers and food producers who rejected conventional agriculture careers to rebuild food systems that make sense. They're not getting rich, but they're making a living doing work that matters. He extracts a frame of capped honey and holds it up to the afternoon sun. The light passes through layers of amber and gold and dark brown, revealing the complexity that only real honey has. He'll harvest this carefully, minimally, leaving enough for the bees to survive winter. The honey he does take will feed families who know its value, who use it as medicine and celebration, who understand they're eating the concentrated essence of this meadow's summer. The meadow is one of hundreds now, scattered across regions that used to be monoculture farmland. Each one is slightly different, reflecting its specific place, its unique combination of soil and climate and plants. The honey from each meadow is distinctive, traceable, irreplaceable. Diversity has returned, not to everywhere, not to the extent that existed before industrial agriculture, but enough to matter, enough to survive. You realize this future isn't guaranteed, it's just possible. It depends on choices being made right now, in 2025, by people who don't yet know they're part of this story. Every time someone chooses real honey over processed honey, supports a local beekeeper, learns to identify quality, teaches a child about food, they're planting seeds for this future meadow. The sun is lower now, golden light slanting across the flowers, and the bees are beginning their evening return to the hives. You can hear them, thousands of wings creating a frequency that feels ancient and peaceful and hopeful. The young beekeeper waves to someone in the distance, another keeper checking their hives in another meadow. They're building something together, slowly, patiently, the way bees build comb and make honey, cell by cell, choice by choice, one small act repeated until it becomes something beautiful and lasting. The evening settles over the meadow now, softer and slower, the light fading from gold to amber to the deep blue that comes just before night, and the last bees are finding their way home through air that smells of cooling grass and closing flowers, and you can hear the settling sounds of the hive as thousands of small bodies press together for warmth and rest. Their work done for today but never truly finished, continuing tomorrow and the day after, in the ancient rhythm that predates human memory, and will likely outlast human forgetting. The beekeeper walks slowly back toward a small building at the meadow's edge, his boots making soft sounds in the grass, and he's carrying the honey frame carefully, reverently almost, as though he understands he's holding something precious that took thousands of hours of labor to create, and that will nourish bodies